proceed with our third panel of policy and legal experts in the order in which they will speak. Our panelists are Lena Masri, who is the National Litigation Director and Acting Civil Rights Director at the Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR, Shelby Chestnut, the National Organizing and Policy Strategist at Transgender Law Center. Thank you. Kristen Clark, who is the President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law. Andrea Centino, Legislative Staff Attorney with the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. And Aviva Vogelstein, Director of Legal Initiatives at the Brandeis Center. Just as a reminder to all, I will cut you off after 7 minutes, so I encourage you to stay within the 7 minutes and to watch the system of lights that we have going. And Ms. Masri, please begin.
Thank you, respected commissioners. The Council on American Islamic Relations is America's largest Muslim civil liberties and advocacy organization. Its mission is to enhance the understanding of Islam, protect civil rights, promote justice, and empower American Muslims. CAIR is dedicated to the foundational ideal of affording all Americans the freedom and dignity to practice their religion. In fact, CAIR is the only Muslim civil rights organization that provides legal services to all cases reported to CAIR that fall within its mission. Nationwide, CAIR employs more than 40 attorneys who provide free legal and advocacy services to individuals who experience religious discrimination and bias. In the process of providing its services, CAIR also assembles data regarding incidents of harassment against American Muslims, the only report of its kind. In April of 2018, CAIR released our annual civil rights report entitled Targeted, a copy of which is attached to the written form of this testimony. The report documents that the Trump administration's Muslim ban has succeeded in stigmatizing Muslims and demonizing Islam, leading to an unprecedented increase in anti-Muslim activity to never before seen levels. The American Muslim community has witnessed an increase in the onslaught of institutional and individualized prejudice against American Muslims in 2017. Since 2014, CAIR has received reports of 16,800 incidents of targeted hate against American Muslims. Between 2016 and 2017, CAIR's records show a 17% increase in incidents of anti-Muslim bias and a 15% increase in hate crimes. Those sharp increases themselves accumulate atop a surge in recent years. From 2014 through 2016, CAIR recorded a 65% increase in incidents of anti-Muslim bias and a staggering 584% increase in hate crimes targeting American Muslims. In 2017 alone, CAIR tracked 300 anti-Muslim hate crimes. The incidents are becoming not only more frequent, but also more violent. Mosques burned down to the ground by arsonists, American Muslims' homes and businesses smeared with threatening graffiti, women harassed on the streets for wearing the hijab or the religious head covering worn by Muslim women, sometimes by aggressors forcibly yanking their hijabs off their heads. In 2017 alone, CAIR recorded 144 anti-mosque incidents. The rise of anti-Muslim sentiment has cost us lives. 2 men were murdered in Portland as they sought to defend a Muslim youth from a knife-wielding aggressor on a train, one of whom we heard testimony from earlier today. There have been Muslims threatened at gunpoint. Muslim children are afraid to go to school, not only because of student-on-student bullying, but teachers-on-student bullying has significantly increased in 2017. Teachers bullying them as terrorists. The chief culprit for this rise in anti-Muslim hate crimes is the Trump administration's various efforts to exclude Muslims from the United States. Courts have recognized the Trump administration's Muslim ban as the fulfillment of then-candidate Trump's call for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. In the aftermath of this Muslim ban, CAIR recorded a deluge of 464 incidents pertaining to it in the last year. Even as CAIR has developed its own data set documenting the rise in anti-Muslim activity, CAIR's experience in the community makes clear that incidents of bias are severely underreported. American Muslims often do not report incidents either to CAIR or to law enforcement for 2 significant reasons. First, members of the American Muslim community fear mistreatment and retaliation from the government itself. 35% of incidents of bias reported to CAIR last year concerned mistreatment by the government, principally by CBP and the FBI. Community members are often afraid to invite the government to probe into the details of private hate discrimination they experience, because that very invitation is perceived as making them vulnerable to even worse consequences by the government itself. It doesn't help, as BuzzFeed News recently documented, that politicians in 49 states have attacked Muslims openly in speeches and with proposed legislation since 2015. Second, members of the American Muslim community consider everyday harassment to be so common that they're desensitized. CARE staff regularly hear of cases in which individuals are harassed but report the incident to CARE and not to government authorities. This often happens because the victim feels that the treatment is expected and normal, that nothing can be done, that they will not be believed or sympathized with by their broader community, or constant anti-Muslim harassment is to be expected in the United States today. Programs and policies, including the Muslim ban, the terrorist screening database, the extreme vetting initiative, and censorship of Palestinian advocacy, must be systematically documented and challenged. Laws aimed at suppressing Islam must be rejected, and the fact that politicians, lawmakers from city councils and state legislatures to Congress and the President of the United States regularly consider anti-Muslim measures is as good of an indication as any that anti-Muslim sentiment in this country has run amok. The government has a significant role to play in combating hate crimes, but it must first establish trust in the American Muslim community that bias and discrimination will not be embodied by the government itself. For the sake of time, our written testimony does include additional recommendations to the Commission. Our annual civil rights reports also contains additional recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder to all panelists that we do have a policy against defamation and degradation, so we need to be careful to link our statements to back. Thank you. Ms. Chestnut.
Good afternoon. My name is Shelby Chestnut, a staff member at the Transgender Law Center. Before I begin, I just want to send a big thank you for convening all of these panelists today. TLC is the largest national trans-led organization in the United States advocating self-determination for all people. Grounded in legal expertise and committed to racial justice, TLC employs a variety of community-driven strategies to keep transgender and gender nonconforming people alive, thriving, and fighting for liberation. In the last decade, transgender people and gender nonconforming people have gone from the shadows to the covers of magazines, courtrooms, and television. This increased visibility has also come with increased public debate, legislative attacks on the rights of transgender people, and sadly, deadly violence. Violence against lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer people, especially transgender and gender nonconforming people, is one of the key civil rights issues of our time, and one that we can no longer ignore. In 2017, according to the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, we lost 28 transgender and gender nonconforming people across the United States to violence, a majority of whom were Black transgender women, making 2017 the deadliest year on record for transgender people. To date, in 2018, this epidemic continues with the murders of at least 8 transgender people. In a moment where society is seeing the increase in intersections of racism, misogyny, classism, and anti-LGBT policies on the state and federal level, it seems clear that addressing this violence transgender people are facing should be a top priority for everyone, especially the federal government, yet no one seems to be hearing the battle cry. Before we can look at solutions, we must understand some of the sources of this violence. Extreme discrimination in employment, education, and housing lead many trans people to see sex work as their best option to survive. But the criminalization of sex work and legislation like SESTA FOSTA makes sex work extremely dangerous for transgender people, contributing to the fatal violence people face. We must stop advancing policies that put the lives of sex workers in danger, and we must address the discrimination that limits opportunities for trans people and forces them into situations where they're vulnerable to trafficking and violence. Violence at the hands of law enforcement remains a persistent issue impacting the lives of trans people across the country. Law enforcement routinely profile transgender people, especially Black transgender women, and criminalize their survival. And worse, add to the violence and mistreatment when handling the homicides of transgender people and oftentimes misgendering them and perpetuating the narrative that they are criminal and deserving of deadly violence. Intimate partner violence or domestic violence, while an epidemic in many people's lives in this country, is an issue of grave concern impacting many transgender people. Stigma and lack of public awareness that IPV can impact people regardless of their gender identity and sexual orientation oftentimes leaves transgender survivors with limited option for support, despite the fact that federal protections like the Violence Against Women Act includes LGBT survivors. State-sanctioned anti-trans legislation, which seeks to dehumanize and limit trans people's access to public accommodations. Much of this legislation is known as the trans bathroom bills, seeks to limit people's access to public restrooms. Far beyond bathroom access, this type of legislation targets trans people's civil rights and opens up the floodgates for broader anti-trans legislation and increases violence towards trans people. We've seen it in North Carolina, Washington State, Texas, Anchorage, Alaska, and now Montana and Massachusetts. When we look at this source of violence and we start to think about solutions, it's clear we have a great deal of work to do to ensure that transgender and gender nonconforming people are central to this conversation. While state and federal hate crime laws were a hard-won battle, aiming to protect many vulnerable populations, we have done very little to increase public awareness for why LGBT people, especially transgender people, are in need of respect and legal protections. State and federal hate crime laws and prosecution are not the answer to protecting transgender communities from violence. Charging one person with a hate crime does nothing to prevent the next murder or increase public awareness on why transgender people are deserving of respect. To take this violence seriously, our country must look at solutions to address conditions transgender people face, especially state and federal elected officials who daily create laws and executive orders that strip transgender people of their rights and dignity. We must work towards a world that values transgender people and one in which the media is uplifting their successes and contributions to society when they're alive and not dead. City, state, and federal funding must be made available to ensure transgender people have access to jobs, housing, education, and we must prioritize prevention programs that promote communities to be accepting and welcoming of transgender people versus criminalizing people. We must denounce the rollbacks and attacks of transgender people's rights and ensure protections like the Violence Against Women Act, HUD's Equal Access Rule, and all federal protections remain in place. Right now, as we speak, hundreds of migrants in a highly publicized caravan wait at the US-Mexico border seeking entry into the US. Among the caravan are a number of LGBT migrants, most of whom are trans women and minors who are fleeing violence in their countries of origin. The group was turned away from the port of entry for several days and experienced harassment and extreme violence in Mexico. This past weekend, the LGBT group was repeatedly turned away from refugee shelters due to transphobia and homophobia. After finally being allowed into a shelter, this group was awoken in the middle of the night by armed men who robbed them, threatened them, and then set the shelter on fire. Where's the public outcry for this horrific violence? Why isn't our government intervening? All of us should demand that Customs, Border Patrol, and Immigration Customs Enforcement allow the remaining members of this caravan entry immediately, or we risk them being killed. I want to close today by offering some of the highlights of the amazing work happening around the country to ensure transgender people are not only protected, but thriving. Last year, TLC represented Ash Whitaker to challenge the Kenosha, Wisconsin school district, who denied him access to the boys' restroom in high school because he was transgender. We fought and won. Ash is now a freshman in college and living his authentic life. Last month in Anchorage, Alaska, transgender people worked with their allies to defeat an anti-trans bathroom measure despite high levels of opposition. Recently, national domestic and sexual violence advocates across the country called for the continued support for transgender rights and shared steps advocates can take locally to ensure transgender people have access to services and are respected when seeking services. Right here in our nation's capital, Ruby Corrado, a transgender Latina woman, runs Casa Ruby and provides housing and services to transgender people 365 days a year. In Montana.
Sorry, the time is up.
Oh, thank
you very much. Ms. Clark.
Good afternoon. My name is Kristen Clark. I'm here on behalf of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, which is one of the nation's oldest racial justice and civil rights organizations. Founded in 1963 at the request of President John F. Kennedy, our principal mission is to secure equal justice for all through the rule of law, targeting in particular the inequities confronting African Americans and other racial minorities. Over the course of the past year, our work to confront our nation's growing hate crime crisis has been one of our top priorities. We know that the hate crime crisis we see today is not new and is rooted in our country's long and tortured history when it comes to racial animus and hatred faced by African Americans and other racial minorities. Our work is carried out with sensitivity to the legacy of white supremacy and the history of racial violence that loom heavy throughout our nation's history. Our Stop Hate project works to strengthen the capacity of communities to confront hate by connecting them to existing legal and social resources and by creating new resources to fill gaps. Our 844-9-NO-HATE hotline serves as a resource for individuals and organizations who have experienced or witnessed hate. And our www.844-9NO-HATE.org website provides Know Your Rights materials and toolkits to support communities combating hate and includes information on hate crimes laws and relevant statutes in all 50 states. I want to use my time this afternoon to talk about the unique challenges that we face in terms of the spike in hate activity online. Violent white supremacists and the alt-right are using online platforms to plan, incite, promote, and generate violence at an unrelenting pace. At the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, part of our work to address this crisis has entailed a concerted focus on how white supremacists exploit racial divisions to reach broader audiences online and in turn incite unlawful, hateful activity. And I want to be clear that there is indeed a meaningful distinction between hate speech and hate activity, especially in the context of the internet. Hateful activity is inciting or engaging in threats, harassment, violence, defamation, intimidation, or other illegal action with bigoted animus. Unlike mere speech, these forms of unlawful conduct are not protected by the First Amendment. They cause tangible and real injury to victims and communities. We believe it is critical to hold private service providers accountable, and I want to talk about some examples of the work that we have been doing in this space. Richard Spencer's altright.com stands as one of the darkest examples of websites that celebrates and encourages racial violence. In the course of our investigation into altright.com, we observed that GoDaddy was providing domain registration services for the site. Altright.com was, in our view, in clear violation of GoDaddy's own terms of service, which clearly prohibit violence, particularly against racial and ethnic minorities. GoDaddy's Universal Terms of Services Agreement required that consumers not use their services in a manner that is illegal or that promotes or encourages illegal activity. Yet we observed countless examples of published content and postings on the site that directed people to, for example, use live ammunition at the border, with the substantial chance that they being immigrants crossing the border, might lose their life in the process. There were other postings on the site which encouraged violence against women and violence against people on the basis of their religion. We went after GoDaddy and pushed them to enforce their own terms of service, which they did, and altright.com went dark last week. We took similar action against Stormfront, the oldest and largest white supremacist hate site online. For more than 25 years, this is a site that has been tied to the deaths of individuals and other violent activities. The Southern Poverty Law Center aptly describes the site as, quote, the murder capital of the internet. Following our action, Network Solutions enforced its own terms of service agreement and pulled Stormfront offline. Stormfront eventually was resurrected by a private services provider, 2 Cows, and we urge this company to closely examine how its services are being manipulated by Stormfront today to incite violence in the US and abroad. In addition to these hate sites, Daily Stormer is a site that has had a particularly devastating impact on young people. In 2018, we filed a lawsuit against the publishers of the Daily Stormer for actions that led to the targeting of an African-American student at American University who had been recently elected as student body president. In this instance, the publishers of the site facilitated a massive campaign of racist trolling activity that disrupted the student's life, impeded her educational experience, made her fearful for her safety, and caused significant physical and emotional trauma. The vicious targeting of the student incited unlawful activity by others online. Using local human rights law here in DC, we are now pursuing a legal challenge against the Daily Stormer and other online trolls for denying the student an equal opportunity to participate in the very aspects of life we take for granted, including taking full advantage of educational institutions right here in DC. Where do we go from here? We believe that action must be taken to encourage more victims to report, to push law enforcement to do a better job investigating hate incidents that arise in their community, and that the Justice Department must play a critical role here as well. 50 years after the tragic assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, we are still working to fulfill the goals which animated his I Have a Dream speech. We know that nonprofit organizations can't do all of the work on its own, and we thank the Commission for focusing on this very important issue today.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. Ms. Santino?
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. My name is Andrea Centino, and I'm a legislative staff attorney with MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Founded in 1968, MALDEF is the nation's leading Latino legal civil rights organization. MALDEF has worked for almost 50 years to confront discrimination and bias wherever they occur. We know intimately how an agenda motivated by hate creates the space for anti-Latino laws, policies, and practices. The rhetoric and messaging that cast Latinos and other underrepresented communities as outsiders and threats are the root of the policies and actions that MALDEF challenges every day. This briefing on the role of the federal government in responding to hate crimes comes at a critical time. In 2016, reported hate crimes reached a 5-year high. The rise in anti-immigrant sentiment and the efforts by state and local governments to enforce immigration laws or to create hostile environments for immigrants leave the Latino community to attack and make it more difficult for our community members to seek protection. Time and again, our community and others have warned the impact that hate rhetoric can have and how it can lead to violent consequences. The federal government and local law enforcement must work to investigate and prosecute hate crimes when they occur, and must send a powerful message to those who might perpetrate hate crimes that these actions will not be normalized. The continual depiction of Latinos as criminals, rapists, and drug dealers, and as threats to the American workforce and the dominant culture, provide those who wish to do us harm the cover that they seek to carry out these biased attacks. The rise in hate crimes against Latinos is certainly motivated by the anti-Latino and exclusionary laws and policies that have long marked our political discourse and that are gaining new steam today. According to the federal government, reported hate crimes in 2016, of those reported hate crimes in 2016, approximately half were motivated by racial bias, and one third motivated by ethnic discrimination. However, as you well know, federal reporting of hate crimes provides an incomplete picture of the problem that we are dealing with. Local law enforcement are encouraged but not required to report hate crimes annually to the FBI. But since these law enforcement agencies are the largest source of information, their non-participation presents a real barrier to truly understanding the scope of this problem. In addition to underreporting, many times hate crimes are incorrectly identified, which adds to the limitation of that this data that is currently collected. For example, if a police officer arrives to the scene of a location and sees vandalism with a slur or a hate image, they may report that incident as vandalism, but not as a hate crime. It's important that everybody does better to ensure that the jurisdictions and the FBI are correctly identifying hate crimes in our communities. There have been some outside efforts to track and document these hate crimes by news outlets and others. However, this presents many limitations as many crimes are not reported in the news or made viral on social media. As hate crimes are going up for many racial and ethnic minorities, we must also discuss how race intersects with gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, and disability, and the heightened risk that certain members of our community face. For instance, Los Angeles County noted that after the 2016 presidential election, there were 31 anti-transgender hate crimes, a 72% increase, and that 97% of those were violent crimes. From 2012 and 2016, hate crime rate of violence rose by 96% against transgender people and by 76% against LGBTQ individuals. Transgender women of color are particularly vulnerable and are disproportionately targeted with deadly violence. In order to have an inclusive discussion about anti-Latino hate crimes in America, we must also recognize and talk about how racial discrimination intersects with sexism, homophobia, and transphobia in our society, which can lead to deadly results for members of our community. MALDEF is also particularly concerned with hate crimes and hate rhetoric in our schools. Immigrant and Latino and other underrepresented students are particularly susceptible to bullying based on their identity. One recent study from 2016 revealed that immigrant youth in the US experience greater rates of bullying than do native-born youth, even when controlling for other factors like age, gender, race and ethnicity, grade level, and family affluence. But Latino students who experience bullying in high school also suffer from significant GPA drops compared to other students. There have been numerous reports of anti-bullying incidents during and after the presidential election. After then candidate Trump called Mexican immigrants racists and criminals, Latino students in Sioux City, Iowa reported being harassed and bullied during school hours as other students chanted Trump's name in their presence. Students at the Rosa Parks Elementary School in Berkeley, California reportedly made statements like, "You live in a Taco Bell and you'll get deported," to other students. And the day after the election, middle school students in Royal Oak, Michigan chanted "Build the Wall," referencing the president's desire to build a border wall between the US and Mexico, bringing several Latino students to tears. The SPLC reported 201 incidents of harassment and intimidation 2 days after the presidential election alone, with anti-immigrant sentiments being the second most reported motivation. MALDEF has created a resource material to educate students, teachers, administrators, and parents about anti-immigrant and anti-Latino bullying and what their rights are. At this critical time, MALDEF is prepared to provide leadership and to work to oppose discrimination and hate against the Latino community living in the United States. We bring cases across the country to resist the tide of anti-Latino sentiment that infiltrates our communities. We have brought litigation on behalf of Latinos that were violently assaulted and detained at work and against anti-Latino agendas at the state and local level. And we remain committed to this fight. MALDEF is ready to meet that challenge before us and to work with you to end hate in our communities and to realize a vision for America that protects every individual from being targeted because of who you are. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Ms. Santino. Ms. Vogelstein.
Chair Lehman and distinguished members of the Commission, it's an honor to appear before you today. I'm Aviva Vogelstein. I'm the Director of Legal Initiatives at the Brandeis Center, an independent, nonpartisan institution for public interest, advocacy, research, and education. Our mission is to advance the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and promote justice for all. In the course of my work as a civil rights lawyer, I've closely studied religiously motivated hate and bias incidents, with a particular focus on anti-Jewish incidents. Religiously motivated hate is undeniably on the rise in our country, and religiously motivated harassment is infiltrating our nation's schools. Some recently reported incidents help illustrate the problem. Last May, a Muslim student was assaulted at a New York City public school. The assailant spit on her and attempted to pull off her hijab. Last November, in Washington State, a 14-year-old Sikh boy wearing a turban was punched and knocked down by a classmate. Just 2 weeks ago, 2 members of a Jewish fraternity at a Maryland university were followed by suspects shouting, "F the Jews," and calling them an ethnic slur. The suspects then followed the victims and began punching one of the victims in the face. At the Brandeis Center, we've assisted students who've been physically assaulted, spit on, verbally harassed, and harassed on social media because of their actual or perceived Jewish identity. Significant data, as many panelists today have mentioned, demonstrate that the numbers of anti-religious hate incidents are high and potentially rising. It's also important to remember the likelihood that many incidents are not even reported. This problem in our schools has been almost entirely ignored until very recently. Until last month, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights did not collect data on religiously motivated harassment and bullying, although it amassed data on sex, race, color, national origin, and disability. The Brandeis Center has long encouraged data gathering on hate against religious minorities. We explained how it's a tremendously important first step to provide an accurate portrait of the problem and necessary to compel an effective governmental response. In 2016, under the leadership of then Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, Catherine Lehman, the Department of Education announced that they would be expanding their mandatory civil rights data collection of America's public schools to include religious-based bullying. OCR's new report, just released, proved the importance of this collection. An alarming 10,848 incidents, 8% of the total incidents in 2015 through 2016, were harassment or bullying based on religion. Now that OCR is finally gathering this information, it has provided us with over 10,000 reasons to take action. It's unconscionable that this category of hate, averaging approximately 30 incidents per school day, 150 per school week, and 602 incidents per school month, has, up until now, been largely unaddressed. Our federal civil rights laws do not properly protect students from harassment based on religion. Harassment and bullying is likely to have lasting psychological and emotional effects on students. Bullying has been linked to many negative outcomes. Kids who are bullied can experience negative physical, school, and mental health issues, and kids who bully others can engage in violent and other risky behaviors into adulthood. The federal government needs to take action to better protect Muslim, Sikh, Jewish, and all students from religiously motivated harassment. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin in federally assisted programs and activities, has a glaring omission. It does not prohibit harassment based on religion. The Department of Education has made incremental improvements. In a 2004 Dear Colleague letter, written by then Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, Ken Marcus, who's currently the president of the Brandeis Center, OCR clarified that Title VI protected students from certain religious groups that also have ethnic or ancestral components, such as Judaism, Islam, or Sikhism. This guidance was largely unenforced for about 6 years, but in 2010, it was reaffirmed by both the Department of Justice and the Department of Education. Though this guidance is currently in effect, there are several concerns. As it's informal guidance, it may not endure through subsequent administrations. Further, OCR could achieve a clearer, more transparent understanding of what is permitted and what is not through providing more guidance. By properly defining what discrimination based on ethnicity or ancestry entails, OCR could more easily identify, address, and prevent such incidents from recurring. OCR should also discuss in guidance, as recommended by the Commission in 2011, the First Amendment implications of anti-bullying policies. The guidance should include that the department's Title VI policies should not be construed in ways that will limit free speech. Moreover, OCR's policies do not protect students from harassment based on religion alone. They require an ethnic or ancestral component. By prohibiting discrimination based on ethnicity or ancestry, without also banning purely religious-based discrimination, Title VI extends greater protections to members of religious groups with shared ethnic or ancestral characteristics than to groups without. All students deserve the same protections. Congress must pass legislation to protect religious minorities from harassment. The new data on religious harassment reveals the extent of the problem. Now that OCR has taken this important first step, we urge OCR to use the new data for its intended purpose, to provide technical assistance where there are patterns of harassment, to assist with investigations in response to complaints, and to compel an effective governmental response. To do so, OCR must both disaggregate the data that has been collected and collect more data, particularly with regards to individual religions, type of harassment or bullying by religion, where the incidents are occurring, and the context behind each incident. This data could be useful for federal investigations and NGO research, but only if more details are added. To help curb religious harassment and bullying, we urge the Commission to make the following recommendations. Perhaps most importantly, Congress must act to prohibit religious harassment in federally assisted programs and activities. This could be achieved through amending existing legislation, such as Title VI of the Civil Rights Act or the Higher Education Opportunities Act, or alternatively, Congress could introduce new standalone legislation to protect students from harassment based on religion. For OCR, OCR should disaggregate existing data and collect additional data on what types of harassment and bullying are occurring by religion, where the incidents are occurring, and the nature and severity of each incident. OCR should also provide clarification and more definitions. And in lieu of time, we urgently need more data, better legislation, and strong enforcement. With over 10,000 incidents of religious hate in our public schools, the federal government must act. Religiously motivated hate is unacceptable and should be combated just as vigorously as all other forms of bigotry. I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you to each panelist, and I'll open it up to my fellow commissioners for questions. Commissioner Yaki?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all of you for your very powerful testimony. We had a lot of discussion earlier in the day about the need for better data collection, for greater participation in that data collection. And of course, I'm not going to talk about any of that. I've been more concerned about how our country has treated both the media and the politicians, the whole notion of what constitutes hate crimes and what helps cultivate the environment for that. And I have a question for you, and it has a legal, and it has a, it has a public connotation. When there's an organized pattern of action against a protected group, whether it's the folks at the Daily Stormfront or whatever the heck it's called, or other organizations, it seems like the media has difficulty in calling it. They call it a hate crime, but part of, to me, it seems like it's a form of domestic terrorism. Now, we don't have a domestic terrorism criminal part of the statute. It's in the Patriot Act, defined for other reasons, but we've only really called, I think, maybe Timothy McVeigh a domestic terror. But there seems to be some reluctance to use that in the context of hate crimes perpetrated against protected classes. And I'd like to get the opinion of Ms. Masri and certainly Ms. Clark about what you think about using that nomenclature more readily for the kinds of activities being perpetrated against protected individuals, as well as whether or not the criminal law itself is sufficient to bring all the tools of the federal government to bear on these sorts of activities.
Thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate your question. It is true. Let's take a step back. Terrorism is any violent activity whose purpose is to terrorize a community. And what we do know is the way that the word terrorism has been disproportionately used against the Muslim community, both in the media by politicians, but also it's resulted in disproportionate prosecutions against the Muslim community. And what that has done is it has fed into the narrative, that the false narrative that all terrorism is committed by Muslims. We also have a larger problem, and that is that the federal government has, in essence, criminalized the Muslim community by creating a terror watch list whose standard in being included into the terror watch list is so low that reasonable suspicion alone is enough to land somebody on the terror watch list. We do know that over 1 million people are on the watch list, and thousands upon thousands of Muslims potentially are on the watch list. And having Muslims being named as known or suspected terrorists without even having ever been charged or committed or convicted of a crime related to terrorism, that also feeds into the public perception that terrorists are all committed.
Whereas hate groups, as defined by the Southern Poverty Law Center, don't get that appellation. They're just called hate groups.
Yes, and the problem is that when terrorism or violence against a community is committed by a non-Muslim, there tends to be a focus on the actual reasons behind that crime. what are the mental health issues that might be in play, the way that particular individual grew up in his home, in his neighborhood, whether he's been bullied in school. Those are the types of discussions that we really should be having if we want to combat terrorism, if we want to combat hate crimes, is to really look at the root cause as opposed to wanting to fall into a false narrative.
Thank you for this very important question, Commissioner Yaki. Hate crimes are unique. They have a devastating impact on the individuals targeted and on communities as well. And for that reason, domestic terrorism feels like an appropriate way to categorize the level of impact and harm that flow from hate crimes when they occur. The challenge, however, is that in this era, we have seen domestic terrorism, the concept, conflated with other things. By way of example, the FBI's Domestic Terrorism and Analysis Unit recently issued a report on so-called Black identity extremism in our country. This appears to be an effort that takes aim on the work of civil rights advocates. It appears to be an effort that harkens back to the era in which the FBI and our federal government placed a target on the back of Dr. Martin Luther King and other activists. So we need to make sure that if we have an agreement that domestic terrorism is an appropriate way to describe hate crimes that are playing out in our country, that we are very clear and have a shared understanding about what we're talking about. And what we should be directing our administration's limited resources to focus on is the rising tide of violent white supremacy in our country and the increase of hate incidents that are perpetrated against historically protected minority groups like African Americans and Latinos, immigrants, religious minorities, and others. And we need to make sure that we have agreement that we are not talking about African American activists, and that we put to rest this Black identity extremism designation, which really should have no place in our democracy today.
Any questions? Commissioner Narasaki?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hello, Ms. Clark. Your testimony noted that the FBI can support efforts to increase reporting by engaging special agents in charge. What would that look like?
Law enforcement must do more to more effectively combat, investigate, and address hate incidents when they arise. One of the things that we've done at the Lawyers Committee is we forged a partnership with the International Association of Chiefs of Police to help strengthen the way in which local police and sheriff's offices go about combating hate today. But to your question, we think that better training for FBI and our federal law enforcement agencies that are tasked with investigating hate incidents when they arise in our country is key.
Great, thank you. Also, there's been a debate all morning about whether the federal government should has a role in addressing hate crimes, either in the education space or in the general space. And I'm interested in hearing what you think whether there should be a federal role, and if so, what is that federal role?
So Commissioner Narasaki, I would just, to amplify my prior response and address your second question, talk very specifically about the role of federal agencies from A to Z. So U.S. attorneys should be supporting the Civil Rights Division to address and clamp down on hate incidents, whether they play inside of our nation's schools or in our college campuses and universities. The FBI should be supporting these efforts as well, and there should be a special agent in charge tasked to respond to hate incidents when they occur. The FBI's Criminal Justice Information Services should also be supporting U.S. attorneys' offices in this effort. The DOJ's, the Justice Department's Bureau of Justice Statistics plays an important role here as well. But we are at a moment where we observe the federal government retreating from this space, not bringing enough cases and not activating the vast resources of the federal government to address these incidents, whether they play out at schools, on campuses, or elsewhere in our country.
I just wanted to add to that while I understand that question to mean what would be the role of the federal government in perhaps prosecuting or pursuing cases against hate crime, and certainly echo the remarks by Ms. Clark. I also would encourage there to be some discussion about the role of funding to encourage prevention of hate crimes in schools and in other areas of our community, to make sure that law enforcement offices, to make sure that federal agencies are equipped to provide that kind of support at the local level to prevent these types of crimes from occurring, or the type of behavior that can lead to those types of crimes from occurring.
Thank you. Ms. Vogelstein, is it Steen or Stein? Sorry. Unfortunately, the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights didn't send a witness, so we don't have an opportunity to explore from them what's going on. I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about what they're doing well and what they need to do better, and also what the impact is of the reported closure of numerous civil rights education complaints on addressing and preventing bias-motivated bullying and harassment in schools might be having on the issue.
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner. So the OCR just released their data about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we were so pleased that for the first time they included their data collection, a mandatory data collection on religious harassment and bullying in public schools. So this is great. What the Office for Civil Rights, what we're recommending they do now is they take this one step further and disaggregate the data that they've collected, and also collect more data. So right now there was a question on the form that said, was there religious harassment or bullying based on religion? And then the respondees wrote how many incidents, but it wasn't separated by religion. So we don't know what percentage of those incidents were anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, anti-Sikh, anti-Christian, any type of a breakdown like that. We also, we don't know by the report that was released what types of incidents are occurring by religion. So we don't know, for example, if they were violent assaults or verbal harassment or assault with a weapon or whatever it was. We also don't know the context behind the incidents. So these are all important things for our federal government to be able to use to take this a step further and fully address the problem.
Have they given a reason for why they didn't ask the question in a more disaggregated way?
There was, I think that because this was the first year that they did it, they were just collecting on religious incidents in general. And I believe there was some debate when they were asking about whether they were going to be collecting data in 2013 about whether it was disclosing the private information of individuals to be asking these questions. Chair Lehman would probably.
Yeah, I can speak to that if you'd like.
Yeah. What I would like to say is that it's really necessary for our government to be disaggregating by religion and providing this additional information. It's not a question about necessarily what the religion is of the students, but on what religious grounds they were targeted. And that's a really important clarification for proper guidance and enforcement by the government.
So I'd also like to ask that throughout the day, those who oppose hate crime laws, particularly on the federal level, have been questioning whether hate crimes are actually on the rise. In your testimony, you said it's undeniably, at least anti-religious, is undeniably on the rise. Some people have said, well, maybe it's just that there's more people reporting because of all the good work that's being done trying to encourage people to report, as opposed to there's an actual rise. Or they've looked at, well, gee, other crimes are rising and this is rising too, and unless it's rising at a faster rate, then I guess apparently we shouldn't be worried. I don't really quite understand that, because I think then you should be worried about any crime that's on the rise, but I wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, thank you. So I've looked at a whole bunch of studies on this across the board, and you're absolutely right that since there is so much that's unreported, we don't necessarily know 100%. But I can say that based on the data, the FBI data, I believe this year there was, I think someone said earlier, there was a 5% increase in hate crimes overall. There was about a 13% increase on hate crimes by religion. There were 50, I think it was 54, over 54% of these hate crimes were anti-Jewish. I think 24% were anti-Muslim. The rest were against everyone else. The anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim incidents have risen significantly since the previous year. I've also looked at surveys by SALT, by the ADL, by the Sikh Coalition, and it appears that the numbers are rising. Whether if it's because there's more reporting than previously, I think it's a good thing that there's more reporting. But every survey that I've looked at shows that the numbers are on the rise.
Madam Chair, am I allowed to ask another question?
Sure.
So when I looked at the data, I have to say I was a little surprised at what the data was for Latinos, given what's going on in the world. But then I was thinking, I'm wondering how much of that is maybe attributable to the increase in fear of the community, not just undocumented, but those who live with undocumented, because we know many live in mixed households. So I'm wondering if you could tell me whether my instincts are correct, or am I totally off base?
So I think that is correct. And I think that to go to the earlier point, when we're looking at whether or not there's a rise in reporting of hate crimes, when you're looking at a population like Latinos and those individuals who live in a mixed status family, a decrease in hate crimes being reported isn't necessarily going to mean that there is a decrease in crimes overall, but rather, as you pointed out, there is a very, very palpable sense of fear running through our community everywhere. Part of that is attributed to the broader attacks on Latino and immigrant communities across the country, the attacks on sanctuary jurisdictions. In Texas, in the wake of SB 4, there were drops in reporting to police of all crimes in Latino communities. And so because people are afraid to come forward for fear of either of some sort of negative retaliation from the federal government, that they might be subject to removal, that a family member may be subject to removal, or in other instances that are probably very common for many other communities, not wanting to report a hate incident in the workplace for fear of losing your job, which might have different repercussions for you and your family, then we are going to see depressed levels of reporting. I think not just of reporting crimes overall, but also of reporting hate crimes. But I think that, looking at the reports that MALDEF has seen, particularly in the wake of the election, the type of violence that's being perpetrated against Latinos certainly indicates and is consistent with the reports that we have seen that, in certain areas, Latino hate crimes are being reported, or increasingly reported. And so I think that, seeing those incidents across the country where someone is targeted because they're Latino, and the rhetoric that is used used to cast them as an outsider because they may or may not be perceived to be an immigrant. And that is, unpopular from our federal government. I think certainly contributes to all of that.
Thank you. And one more?
Okay, this is your last one.
Okay, sorry. Ms. Chestnut. So I'm struck by your very strong statement that from your perspective, a hate crime law doesn't help. And anti-Asian violence is something that actually brought me into the movement. And one of my frustrations was that really it was hard to get people to see those kinds of crimes committed against Asians as a hate crime, because at the time, Asian Americans weren't really being even thought about because it was a small population. And on top of that frustration was the media did not cover those hate crimes. You would not see it on Good Morning America. You would not see it on nightly news. At best, you would see it in a local paper, and probably not even on television. I worked very hard to get those crimes seen, because I thought it was very important for people to understand that, in fact, you're being targeted as a group, right? It's not you being targeted as an individual. And to force people to see, in fact, that that was happening and to get those stories told. So, so I wanted to kind of better understand, because I will say that having worked with victims of anti-Asian violence, I do feel that, you know, it's more important to work on trying to stop it from the beginning, because I learned that even if you prosecute someone and put them away, you can't put the family back together, right? That family, that community is irretrievably broken. So I get the fact that laws enough are not enough alone, but I just wanted to probe a little bit more sort of where that comes from.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it sounds like a lot of our work has similarities. And I think from a trans perspective, it's important to note that, like, we don't even know how many trans people exist in the United States, and certainly the media is doing very little to cover sort of trans people in a healthy manner. It's, if you ask sort of most Americans what they think, how they've seen trans people portrayed, it's a sex worker, it's when they're dead, it's as a criminal. You know, and much of our work at the Trans Law Center is how do we make sure that society understands the value of trans people and sort of what they're adding to this society as a whole. You know, and that said, it needs to come from an abolitionist framework. And for me, something that I think really shifted personally for me in my mind was a number of years ago, there was a young woman, her name was Ilan Nettles. She was a 20-something transgender woman in Harlem, New York, and she was killed because she was trans. She had been on the street at night. A young man, Ilan Nettles was African-American, as was the man who killed her. He saw her on the street, he catcalled her, thought she was really cute. He didn't know that she was trans. She died. He started getting made fun of by his friends, and he pushed her to the ground, and she died of a trauma to her head. You know, the police arrived, they didn't realize that she was trans, so the hate crimes unit wasn't called at all immediately. They figured out she was trans by the time they got her to the hospital. This young woman was on life support, and it took about 6 months to find the man who had harmed her and ultimately killed her. And I remember sitting in the courtroom with the victim's mother the day that the sentence came for this young man. He's 24 years old. He's going to spend 12 years in prison. He was not charged with a hate crime. He was charged with second-degree murder, I believe. You know, and some of the community's outraged. They're like, "Why isn't this a hate crime?" And in my mind, I'm thinking, this young man's going to go to prison for 12 years. He's known to have killed a trans person, so he's not going to be targeted that he killed a trans person. He'll be targeted that he was attracted to a trans woman, and he got busted for it. He'll probably get raped in prison. He'll get harassed the whole time he's there by other inmates, and he'll get released, and he'll, one, not think any differently of trans people to value them. His friends will probably taunt him for the rest of his life. And if anything, escalate violence when they see another trans person in their neighborhood. So for me, I think what was most devastating of that is that it was a community that was impacted by it. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't a white man attacking a community of color. It was a young Black man attacking another young Black woman. And what are we doing as a whole? And I don't want to target at one specific community. This is an epidemic. How do we think about that education and, you know, make people understand that violence against trans people is harming us all, and that trans people, they're not making national news at all. I mean, anywhere. And it's kind of our responsibility to start talking about that. And at a very young age, young kids who are trans should be able to go to school and be safe, and they're not. And then they're living up to be, you know, to grow up and be killed. So I guess to me, it's all very connected. And how do we start that early intervention?
Great, thank you.
Commissioner Dykman.
Yes, thank you for your testimony. This question is open to anybody who wants to take a cut at it. I'm trying to understand what the root cause, what we understand the root cause or causes of underreporting to be, because I don't think that we can really move the dial until we have a deeper understanding about why it is that jurisdictions don't report these types of crimes. And so if you all can help us understand what those causes are, we might be better able to recommend things that can move the dial. But if we don't know, if we don't have an understanding of what those root causes are, I think the pattern is probably going to continue.
I mean, I can quickly just say this. I think there's fear of reporting to law enforcement or official government agencies of not being believed or being mistreated as you're reporting. But I think the reality of it is find me an LGBT person who hasn't at some time in their life been called an anti-LGBT epithet or worse, and just normalized it and started to sort of say like, well, you know, at least I wasn't like beat up today. I was just called like an anti-LGBT epithet while walking to work. So I think part of it's shifting how society wants to think about these things, but also encouraging people not to normalize constant harassment.
And I can add to that as well. From the Muslim community's perspective, a lot of the hate crimes that are occurring are a direct response to a lot of the sentiment that's been pushed by politicians and elected officials by the government. And there's also a perception of government policy specifically targeting the Muslim community. And so as a result, there is a genuine fear among Muslims of reporting any hate crime that occurs because they fear additional consequences from their interaction with government officials. On the other hand, anti-Muslim sentiment and hate crimes, harassment, intimidation has become so commonplace that people underestimate it, or they set it aside as a common occurrence. They don't think that their individual circumstances are important enough to report it or to bring it to anybody's attention. So it is important that the government first establish trust in order to increase the reporting. There's also other mechanisms of getting reports, and that is through state and local agencies that do reporting, but are not, their records are not being transferred into any type of central database. There should be a focus on the federal government to create a central database from all the rights commissions, state agencies that are collecting, that will at least increase the numbers that are coming in.
I can add to that. So our federal civil rights laws don't properly protect students from religious harassment. OCR has extended the protections of Title VI to protect students based on ethnicity or ancestry, but not specifically religion. So through clearer guidance from the Department of Education and through legislation that protects religious students from harassment, there could be better reporting as well as better enforcement of incidents.
Yep. Thank you for that question, Commissioner Adegbile. I think that this is a very important issue that requires work from a few different angles. Building trust with communities that tend to be targeted by hate crimes is key. And one way for law enforcement agencies to build that trust is to ensure that their ranks reflect the diversity of the communities that they endeavor to protect and serve. They should meet and convene regularly with communities, hear from them, understand the ways in which they are impacted. Law enforcement stands to learn a lot from communities through meaningful and real engagement. I also think that it is important to be very intentional about wanting to hear from victims. Through our work with the International Association of Chiefs of Police, we've had law enforcement share that they had not done enough to make fighting hate crimes a priority. And last summer, through our work with that group, they passed a resolution that made fighting hate crimes a priority, which by itself sends a strong message to the communities that you care about hate crimes and want to hear from people when they are victimized. But on a more micro level, I think it's important when we're talking about hate crimes inflicted on undocumented and immigrant communities to have a very clear and unmistaken policy that someone's status will not be used against them if they call to report a crime or an incident. So there are many ways that we can work to attack this issue. Trust is paramount, but policies, training, and engaging with communities, I think, are equally important parts of the strategy as well.
Ms. Clark, if I could follow up for a moment. Earlier, I think that DOJ representative shared some of this notion about engaging with communities, as did some of the other law enforcement officers. My understanding is, and I don't know if I have this right, but my understanding is that the future of the Community Relations Service of DOJ is in some doubt at this point. And I'm wondering if that is consistent with this notion that in order to discharge the duty of connecting with communities, taking apart an apparatus that was established as part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act for purposes of having outreach into communities and providing a mechanism for positive discussion that is not just treating DOJ as only an enforcement tool. I'm trying to figure out how this lines up with that professed need of law enforcement.
The U.S. Department of Justice is our nation's largest and most important federal law enforcement agency. And for sure, the Community Relations Service is the one part of this vast agency that has been tasked for decades with connecting with communities, resolving conflicts, bringing communities that are divided together. We deemed it devastating to hear that the budget has been wiped out for this critical part of DOJ, and we think that it turns the clock back decades in efforts to ensure that the Justice Department is able to step into communities that have been impacted and devastated by hate crimes, and really get in there and work together to bring people together, to promote unity in a way that is so needed on the heels of a hate crime. This is the peacekeeping arm of the Justice Department, and we hope that in the weeks ahead we'll see Congress working with DOJ to reverse the decision to wipe away what truly is one of the most critical parts of our U.S. Department of Justice.
Thank you.
Mr. Gladney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question only because we talked a lot about data in the last couple of years, and reporting going up in the last couple of years. What do those numbers and reports look like, say, for the last 10 years or 20 years? Have they been on the increase or have they been on the decline? Are you talking about the last 2 years because there was such a tremendous percentage increase? If I could have some answers, I'd appreciate that. If you know what the numbers are or what the percentages have been, or if you can lay your hands on those numbers. Okay.
So I'll just say, from our review, according to BJS statistics from 2004 to 2015, the average number of hate crimes reported was about 250,000, and that annually, each year. Wait, that can.
Sounds like a lot.
I'll review if that was actually annually. But we saw that it looked as though, from 2004 to 2015, there were changes, there were fluctuations up. Our understanding is that hate crime reporting didn't dip significantly, or there were no significant kind of decreases, but rather there were changes, particularly for Latinos, that there were periods of increased reporting, but never kind of dramatic drops. And so we were always looking at a rate of either a steady level of reporting for hate crimes against Latinos or an increased level for the past 10 years. And we were certainly able to follow up on that one statistic. And then our other understanding is that for the period between 2011 and 2015, the most common motivation for hate crimes was racial bias.
Ms. Vogelstein, looked like you maybe took out some data.
Yeah, I'll just add something. Well, I got the FBI data, and I do know that FBI hate crime reporting, what was reported, there were something like 500 more victims in 2016 than in 2015. 615 victims in 2016, and I don't have the 2015 data right in front of me, but it was about 500 less. I will also say with anti-Semitic hatred specifically, the ADL released a study in January, and I believe that they found that that anti-Semitic incidents increased by 59% from 2015 through 2016, right. Or sorry, 2016 through 2017.
Well, I understand that. I was just trying to see what the results were the last 10 years.
Oh, so I don't know all of the data, but I do know that this past year of the ADL's report was the second highest number since they started reporting in the 1970s.
Marcy, I'm sure you have something to say.
Yes, in terms of our internal statistics, I can't give you the numbers offhand, but I can tell you that generally what we saw was a spike, an increase of hate crimes post 9/11. And a second spike was post-election last year. Post-election last year, we saw a significant spike in bullying as well. And as I mentioned earlier, specifically teachers on students bullying has spiked in the last year. Generally speaking, since 9/11, hate crimes has been pretty much steadily increasing, with the exception of the spikes that I just mentioned.
I was wondering if because we're running out of time, and I know that the chair is very strict.
True, and I have some questions.
So my question is, do you have charts for your individual groups that you represent in this regard that you can submit? Because I think a chart, especially if we could put it in a report of say 10 or 20 years of reporting for you, like religious or Latino or African American or transgender or Muslim, would be very effective in terms of seeing what exactly is happening, because everybody's been talking about data all day, and it would be nice to see it. Thank you.
Can I just, just to go back to the earlier point, the statistic that I cited, it is indeed 250,000 average each year from 2004 to 2015. The data is based on BJS statistics as well as the National Crime Victimization Surveys and other data that the federal government pulled together, and we'd be happy to provide this information.
Thanks very much. Ms. Clark, you testified earlier that we are at a moment where we observe the federal government retreating from its hate crime enforcement work and not bringing up cases and not addressing hate crimes. At an earlier panel and also in written testimony that we received from DOJ, we heard that combating hate crimes is among the highest priorities for the Civil Rights Division and the Justice Department, and a commitment for the department to use all of our investigative and prosecutorial authority to bring perpetrators to justice. We also heard touting that since January 2017, the department has brought hate crimes charges against more than 24 defendants and obtained 22 convictions. I note that that does contrast with the prior administration's record with respect to hate crimes charges, on average about 32.25 charges per year. So it does look like there may be some decline, but who knows in 1 year. I'm just curious from your perspective from the Stop Hate work that you've been doing, if you could concretize what you mean about seeing the Department of Justice now retreating from hate crimes enforcement, because that stands in pretty stark contrast to the testimony we received.
Thank you very much for that question, Commissioner Lehman, and for your leadership in focusing the Commission's attention on this crisis. Words must be backed by action. And from our perspective, many of the new hate incidents and hate crimes that have been happening across our country over the past year and a half have been ones in which we've seen silence from the Justice Department and silence from our Attorney General. I think that these moments are moments that really require leadership, require that we have an Attorney General prepared to stand up and use the bully pulpit of the office to condemn hate, to condemn the impact that hate has on communities. An Attorney General who can sympathize with the victims and communities that have been targeted. It is my observation that Attorney General Jeff Sessions has not done enough to use the bully pulpit and unique powers of the office to speak out, confront hate, and to support local law enforcement in investigating these incidents when they arise, or in taking concerted action to have the federal government lead and spearhead more investigations at the federal level into hate incidents that are taking place in our country. That said, I will give credit to the Justice Department for completing investigations that were initiated and started during the prior administration. And I think that those have provided some moments for this administration to essentially take credit for work that was already well underway before the clock started on this new administration's efforts. It is our goal and intention to bring pressure to bear on this Justice Department to stand up to hate. We feel that it is important for the Justice Department to do more than it has presently.
Very much. Ms. Chestnut, you made, I thought, a very compelling argument for focusing on prevention, and I wonder if you could give us some recommendations for what kinds of prevention areas you think are most fruitful or most necessary.
There's been a number of campaigns that have started ahead of sort of states pushing anti-trans ballot measures, and really just public education, because most of Americans, when polled, they aren't against anti-discrimination protections, but when they go to vote, they don't know what they're voting on, and they don't understand what transgender people, who they are and what they mean. So simply like public education campaigns. And I know a number of years ago, DC ran one that was quite successful. And it really was just like putting trans people sort of in the day-to-day life, like, hey, I'm trans and I work with you. California has run a very successful campaign thinking that they were going to have a ballot measure called Transform California. And it was about educating local business owners on like who transgender people are, what they might look like, and that it doesn't really matter that they're transgender, just like don't violate their rights. You know, and I think part of it is pushing the media around these narratives and moving away from this, like, only talk about trans people when they're dead. You know, certainly people like Janet Mock and Laverne Cox have done wonders to sort of bolster this, like, image of trans people. But the reality of it is not everyone is a Janet Mock or a Laverne Cox, and understanding that you might have trans people working at Bank of America or at McDonald's or right here at the commission. And educating people, you know, like asking people's pronouns at work is a huge step. I was impressed when coordinating this. Staff member was like, "Can I ask your pronouns?" You know, that's uncommon in my experience. So things like that, which are just simple and actions that people really overlook. The healthcare component is huge. You know, like what we might lose with healthcare for trans people. It's like, never mind transition-related care. It's like people's just ability to go to the doctor and be safe is what's the priority here. So, you know, general education that can start in elementary school and go all the way up. And frankly, young people are leading the charge here right now. There's amazing young people around the country organizing, and adults need to catch up to them.
Thanks very much. Commissioner Kirsten, I think will be our last question.
Great, thank you. Thanks to everybody. Just one quick question. Is there any better database for assessing the rate and number of hate crimes than the FBI's hate crime statistics database, or putting it another way, the Bureau of Justice Statistics database, either from a quantitative or qualitative perspective?
I mean, an initiative that a number of groups in this room are part of was the Communities Against Hate, which was an initiative that started right after the election. I think did a much better job at bringing groups together. I mean, I'll be frank that the FBI statistics don't include trans people, so we don't have any idea how many trans people are harmed. And part of it's like including communities that might otherwise be excluded from this information. So I don't know the website, but I'm sure one of these groups, which I'm sure, I think some of these groups are part of, would know the web address.
I'll just add that OCR's mandatory civil rights data collection could be tremendously helpful, especially if more data is added for religious harassment.
Certainly a fan of that database, I will say. But Ms. Chestnut, if I could, having said that was going to be the last question, I'm going to ask you one more. Robert Musi, I think, testified earlier today about the regular receipt of data about trans hate crimes or potential hate crimes coming in, I think, on a quarterly basis to the DOJ. And I wonder if you have any information about whether the DOJ then collects that and reports that out in a way that is accessible to others or usable for the DOJ itself.
I can't speak to how it is, but my guess is that it's coming from local law enforcement agencies. And the problem with it is one, there's grave concern that law enforcement should be collecting information on gender identity or sexual orientation to some matter, given the nature in which trans people are targeted by many different aspects of the community. But then two, oftentimes they're not collecting information on gender identity. So like it might be a biased crime related to their LGBT identity, but we have no sense of knowing how it's then broken down. So the data, we need to start counting trans people in the first place before, like in other areas of the world, before we can then assume that that information is actually making it, because it's not.
Thanks very much. Thank you again to this very powerful panel. We really appreciate it. We are going to come back in 10 minutes at 2:30 for our next panel today.
I lasted for 3 panels. That's pretty good. One more. Yeah, but I don't have to think of public. No.
commandeer. So much in life and policy about time.
Hello, hello.
I disagree with your TV interview by Skype. 9:15. My wife just said you can't. Oh. Today's our anniversary.
Cannot sign off.
Lynn, Roy, Sophia, Debbie.
Can it come? Yeah.
Yes. Is the order roll? Because that's what I had in the paper. We have
Laura, do we need a quorum for the, so I can go to sleep? I mean, I will. No, it's actually short.
Thank you. Thank you.
So it looks like, I'm gonna double check right now.
Oh, so you just get next.
Speak and
Okay, I'm getting us started on time for our fourth panel of the day. It's a panel of current and former federal officials in the order in which they will speak. Our panelists are Dr. Lynn Langton, Chief of the Victimization Statistics Unit at the Bureau of Justice Statistics at the U.S. Department of Justice, Roy Austin, who's a partner at Harris, Wiltshire & Granis, LLP, and former Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice, Cynthia Dietl, Programs and Operations Director at the Matthew Shepard Foundation and former Civil Rights Unit Chief at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Debbie Osgood, who is a partner at Hogan, Marin, Babbo, and Rose, and former National Enforcement Director at the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, and Olabisi Akuba Deja of Counsel at Ballard Spa and former Supervisory General Attorney at the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. Dr. Langton, please begin.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the Bureau of Justice Statistics efforts to understand the level and nature of hate crime experienced by residents of our country. As Deputy Assistant Attorney General Robert Musi noted in his earlier remarks, the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Justice Statistics have long recognized the importance of having accurate and reliable data on hate crime, and we continually work to improve our efforts to provide better and more timely data. As you know, the Department of Justice administers the country's two primary collections of statistical data on hate crime. The first is the FBI's Hate Crime Statistics Program, which of course part of the UCR, and these data are compiled by local law enforcement agencies and reflect crimes that are known to police and recorded as hate crimes by police. The second source of statistical data, which I'll focus more on today, is the Bureau of Justice Statistics National Crime Victimization Survey. The NCVS is a nationally representative household-based survey that asks residents aged 12 or older about their experiences with crime, including crimes motivated by hate or bias. Both of these collections, the NCVS and the UCR, define hate crime according to the Hate Crime Statistics Act, including crimes motivated by bias against the victim because of his or her race or ethnicity, gender or gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, or disability. Now, the way this is operationalized in the NCVS is that when a respondent answers affirmingly that they experienced a violent or a property crime, that respondent is then asked a series of questions about the nature of the incident, including whether they believe the incident was motivated by bias against them. The survey also asks victims whether they had any evidence that the crime was motivated by hate. And in order to be classified as a victim of hate crime in the NCVS, the victim has to state that the offender either used hate language, left hate symbols at the scene of the crime, or that police investigators confirmed that it was a hate crime. Next. The NCVS and the UCR are designed to be complementary but different. So despite the fact that they're both aligned with the Hate Crime Statistics Act, there are differences between them in the types of crime that they cover, in the types of victims that they cover, in the fact that the NCVS is based on residents' perceptions of hate crime, which may be a different standard of proof than what's required for law enforcement to record a crime as a hate crime. And another major difference is that the NCVS captures hate crimes both reported and not reported to the police. And we can see the impact of these differences in the data. So this figure here compares the annual average number of hate crimes according to the NCVS with those captured by the UCR. So if you start on the left with the light blue column, based on NCVS data, there were over 210,000 hate crimes occurring annually from 2014 to 2016, slightly different than the number that was cited by the earlier panel just because of the difference in the time frame. But of those 211,000 hate crimes, about 210,000, about 50%, were reported to the police. So based on NCVS data collected from the victims, we have 110,000 reported to the police. Now, of those, about 14% were confirmed by police investigators to be a hate crime. So about 16,000, which gets us much closer to the UCR annual average for this same period, which is about 7,000, that last bar there at the end. So this figure illustrates that the hate crimes captured in the UCR data represent a small portion of the total number of hate crimes occurring annually. Because the NCVS is capturing a substantially larger number of hate crimes than the UCR, the two collections also show a somewhat different picture of the types of bias motivating these crimes. In both collections, as you can see on the far left, the largest proportion of hate crimes are motivated by racial or ethnic bias. However, the NCVS shows a larger proportion of hate crimes motivated by gender bias, sexual orientation bias, or disability bias. This figure shows the trends in the number of hate crimes reported, the red line, and not reported, the darker line, to police from 2009 to 2016. Overall, during this period, there was no statistically significant change in the number of hate crimes occurring each year, but the estimate does appear to be trending downward. This is particularly true among hate crimes not reported to the police, which seem to be driving any apparent decline in the total number of hate crimes during this period. Using NCVS data, we can also examine trends in the type of bias behind the hate crimes. So from 2009 to 2016, the percent of hate crimes believed to be motivated by gender bias, that's the purple line, the second line there, doubled. The percentage of hate crimes motivated by sexual orientation bias, that's the light blue line, also appeared to increase but was not statistically significant. And then the other thing to note here is that from 2009 to 2015, the percentage of hate crimes motivated by religious bias declined, but appeared to tick upward in 2016, and it remains to be seen whether it will continue on that trajectory. So through the NCVS and the UCR, the Department of Justice provides important indicators of the patterns and trends in hate crime victimizations. But as I mentioned earlier, efforts are underway to build upon and improve those efforts. For instance, in 2016, the NCVS shifted to a sample design that will eventually allow for estimates of crime to be generated not just at the national level, but also for the 22 most populous states, which account for about 80% of the population. Both the NCVS and the UCR are also focused on increasing the timeliness of data and data reporting. NCVS estimates are typically released 8 to 10 months after the year ends. So we anticipate releasing 2017 data in the fall of 2018. And part of that lag is due to the complexity of the survey and the work that the Census Bureau has to do to process the files. And part of that is for BJS statisticians to analyze the data, verify the results, produce the report. So those aspects of the processing time are difficult to reduce, but BJS is exploring other options for making the data available sooner, such as publishing preliminary half-year estimates based on the first 6 months of the year. These efforts are also just one part of the work being undertaken by the DOJ Hate Crime Statistics Working Group, which was established through the Attorney General's Task Force on Crime Reduction and Public Safety to improve the compilation and aggregation of hate crime statistics. So in summary, hate crime identification, enforcement, and prevention is a priority for the DOJ.
Ms. Langton, I have to stop you. I'm sorry. I wasn't paying enough attention and we're well over time. Thank you. Mr. Austin.
Thank you and good afternoon. Thank you and good afternoon. I come to you as a former hate crimes prosecutor and a supervisor of hate crimes prosecutor. I personally prosecuted a cross burning in Illinois and a pistol whipping in Mississippi. I was a supervisor at the time that the first prosecutions under the Shepard-Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act were being brought. A major problem with respect to hate crimes statistics is quite obvious. We do not have the slightest idea how many hate crimes there are in America, and we have never known. The numbers currently kept by the FBI, and I'm speaking primarily of the FBI, not to insult my former colleague, Langston, the numbers currently kept by the FBI are largely useless. While a small handful of states and law enforcement agencies seem to take the collection of hate crime numbers seriously, the majority of states and vast majority of law enforcement agencies do not seriously report hate crimes numbers, and the handful of numbers that are reported are released late and unaudited. Basically, the FBI has little choice but to get whatever it gets from jurisdictions, and they put those numbers out publicly without any meaningful analysis. But what do these numbers mean? What policy decisions can be made based on these numbers? What enforcement decisions can be made based on these numbers? Sadly, the answer to all of these questions is almost nothing. The importance of collecting good data could hardly be overstated. While every crime is significant, the harm can be exponential when the subject targeted the victim based on his or her actual or perceived race, ethnicity, religion, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. The pain or fear from hate crime reaches a broader community. The act is anathema to who we are as a nation built on diversity. Now, my criticism of the numbers is not meant to criticize the individuals who work for the FBI's Criminal Justice Information Services Division, CJIS. As someone who worked with this team both when I was at the Department of Justice and at the White House, I know it to be a team of smart and hardworking individuals who care deeply about their work collecting crime data. The team is willing to provide individualized training to any agency that needs it or needs help reporting hate crime numbers. But few take them up on this offer. The problems are structural. The team is under-resourced for work that's important, and where there are no incentives for providing this data, their task is largely impossible. This problem would be relatively easy to fix. Make federal government funding contingent on providing accurate hate crime data. But where we do not even mandate that law enforcement agencies provide general crime statistics, it will require serious leadership to move the ball in this direction on hate crime statistics. Now, what exacerbates the problem is the fact that the federal government does not even publish its own hate crimes numbers. The FBI works on hate crimes cases across the country with the Civil Rights Division and the U.S. Attorney's offices, and none of those DOJ components regularly publishes in an easily accessible location any data about those cases. Now, I understand that Robert Musi came here and testified earlier. I am very familiar with Robert and very familiar with the work that was done by the Civil Rights Division, and I know that we did not regularly publish those numbers in the Obama administration. Now, how can the federal government expect state and local law enforcement to publish data when it does not do so itself? Now, it only requires a quick look at the FBI hate crime statistics to realize just how unhelpful they are. The first thing one might notice is that the most up-to-date statistics are from 2016. We are now almost halfway through 2018, and we still do not have national statistics for 2017. There are approximately 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States, and almost 3,000 agencies did not even bother to respond to the FBI request for hate crime information. And they suffer no consequences for not doing so. Now, from the 15,000 agencies that at least responded, there were only 6,121 reported incidents. Of these incidents, California reported 931, New York reported 595, but Alabama reported just 14 incidents, and Mississippi reported just 7. Now, for reasons unknown to me, the state of Hawaii doesn't participate at all. And then what also stands out are the number of large and good-sized cities that report that they did not have a single hate crime in 2016. Mobile, Alabama, Corona, California, Wilmington, Delaware, Savannah, Chattanooga metropolitan area, Georgia, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Evansville, Indiana, Topeka, Kansas, Shreveport, Louisiana, Springfield, Missouri, Patterson, New Jersey, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Fargo, North Dakota, Charleston, South Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina, Corpus Christi, Texas, Laredo, Texas, Lubbock, Texas, Provo, Utah, Roanoke, Virginia, Kenosha, Wisconsin, and Cheyenne, Wyoming, I guess did not have a single hate crime in 2016. Here are just some thoughts on ways the federal government could improve the current system. 1, make reporting mandatory. Congress could pass a law that made law enforcement agencies that do not provide hate crime data ineligible for federal law enforcement grants from the Department of Justice or any other federal agency. 2, audit reports. The FBI should have a team that audits the reports provided by law enforcement agencies to ensure accuracy. 3, publish the data quarterly. I'm happy to hear that Lynn noted that there's thoughts about publishing the data at least twice a year, but there's no reason why it shouldn't be reported quarterly. The FBI's hate crime statistics are collected quarterly. If the FBI actually published quarterly, it would not only provide data in a more timely fashion, but would give more transparency to the effort. By publishing quarterly, individuals who are aware of hate crimes would be better equipped to force their jurisdiction to correct mistakes. 4th, work with affinity groups to encourage reporting. Hate crime collection can be challenging because it requires work with communities who are often distrustful of law enforcement because of bad prior experiences or lack of language access. Affinity groups may be better positioned to collect the information and report it to law enforcement even in situations where the victim does not want to participate in prosecution. It is sad, the numbers that Lynn put up there, showing that probably less than 10% of the hate crimes that are reported to law enforcement even show up in the UCR. Number 5, get federal agencies report. Number 6, just have better reports. If you try to look at this time at the paperwork that is presented by the UCR, it is unbelievably hard to read in this day and age. Thank you.
Mr. Austin. Ms. Deagle?
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm grateful to the U.S. Commission for inviting me to participate in this discussion with such distinguished panelists. From 1995 until 2017, I was employed as a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I was extremely fortunate to be able to devote my career to the Civil Rights Program as a street agent in New York City for 12 years, as the chief of the Civil Rights Unit, and as a supervisor in Boston. I specifically joined the Bureau to investigate allegations of police brutality and violence motivated by hate and bias. As a civil rights agent, I was honored to use the power of the FBI to protect those most vulnerable in our communities from police officers who use excessive and unreasonable force, and those individuals who target certain folks for violence based on race, religion, ethnicity, disability, or sexual orientation. Upon my retirement, I joined the Matthew Shepard Foundation to continue their mission to erase hate through law enforcement training, community outreach, and youth programming. The foundation was founded 20 years ago by Dennis and Judy Shepard, whose son Matt was targeted, attacked, and murdered because he was gay. As you are aware, they fought for passage of the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crime Prevention Act of 2009, which greatly expanded the jurisdiction of the FBI and the Department of Justice to investigate bias crimes. In my 22-year career, I learned a few things along the way which I'd like to share. Street credibility is imperative. If you're a law enforcement official, prosecutor, victims advocate, or community leader, you must be a believer and a doer. You must believe that hate crime laws are necessary to keep communities safe. You must believe that enforcement of these laws is mandatory. And you must believe that reporting hate crimes to your state and to the FBI is one of the most effective ways to mitigate hate-fueled violence. If you are not a believer and you are not experienced and passionate about eradicating bias crimes, your law enforcement and special interest partners will not have confidence in your commitment to join them in their quest for equality and justice. Spend the time to learn about hate crimes, investigate a good number of them, and earn some street credibility. You must be honest and transparent. The federal government actors tasked with responsibility of investigating and prosecuting hate crimes must be honest and transparent when they carry out their mission. While everyone understands that there are some well-established laws and policies requiring confidentiality in the law enforcement arena, agents and prosecutors must keep an open line of communication with the victim and the community and share what they can. Timely transparency builds trust, and trust leads to safe communities. All the players must start from the same place. Building trust between minority communities and law enforcement officers was one of my goals as chief of the Civil Rights Unit in the FBI, as well as my mission as a program and operations director for the Matthew Shepard Foundation. If officers trust civilians to report crimes in an honest and timely manner, and the victims have confidence that the officers will conduct a thorough and professional investigation, everyone is safer. This symbiotic relationship, however, assumes that each player starts at the same place. This equation takes for granted that the officers had been trained to recognize a hate crime, how to collect evidence of bias, and how to use that evidence to successfully prosecute the perpetrator. It also assumes that law enforcement agencies believe that their jurisdiction should enact and enforce hate crime laws. If the bias motivation of the crime is ignored, the victim will not feel validated, safe, or protected in her community. Accept and acknowledge the past. We are all aware that it wasn't that long ago that law enforcement officers were some of the very people who initiated and facilitated lynchings of African Americans, targeted LGBT community members for harassment and violence, and intentionally failed to protect many other minorities from hate crimes. If the FBI agents working civil rights violations do not accept and acknowledge these facts, they will not earn the trust and respect of the children of these victims, some of whom are facing the potential for the same victimization. Be a leader in the fight for equality and justice. As an FBI agent or government actor involved in eradicating hate, you must be a leader in the fight for justice and equality. Not only must you uphold the rule of law and the Constitution, but you must find new and innovative ways to build relationships, earn the trust of community leaders and minority groups, and you must promote professionalism and integrity. For countless people I met in my career, I was the first and only FBI agent they ever encountered. I had the honor and duty to ensure that they were left with the belief and the impression that the FBI was an honorable and honest institution. No one wins. Hate destroys everyone it touches, the victim, the perpetrator, their families, and the community. When a hate crime is committed, the victim is hurt, traumatized, fearful, and is forever changed. The perpetrator and his family, however, are often overlooked when it comes to examining the fallout from a bias incident. In many cases I investigated, the family of the perpetrator was forever changed as well, as they learned that they would be seen as bigots, regardless of their claims of innocence or tolerance. Oftentimes, the perpetrator acted in a violent and biased manner because of their own trauma, their upbringing, and their substance addiction. Federal investigators and prosecutors must be mindful of these family members and must appreciate that the ripples of hate extend far beyond the targeted victim. Thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts. I look forward to hearing from the others today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Deagle. Ms. Osgood.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I had the privilege of serving for the Office for Civil Rights for 25 years, both in headquarters with the current commission chair and in the Chicago regional office. And I was very proud of my service, public service with the federal government, and very proud of OCR's long-stated mission of ensuring equal access to education and promoting educational excellence throughout the nation through the vigorous enforcement of the federal civil rights laws. What I'm going to focus on today, given my background, is the critical role that OCR and the Department of Education must continue to play in preventing and addressing the harassment of students in our schools. I strongly believe that OCR has made a tremendous impact in this area, and both in its leadership and in the comprehensive approach it has taken to preventing and addressing harassment. Through regulations, policy guidance, investigations, and technical assistance, we have seen progress and greater compliance by educational institutions in the area of harassment. And one example I want to give is that I think that because of OCR's policy guidance and strong, robust enforcement work in the area of sexual harassment and sexual violence, we have a totally different culture at our schools. And the expectations of parents and students and the communities is different. People expect that schools will comply with Title IX, that they will prevent and address sexual harassment, sexual violence when it occurs, and they view that as part of the educational package, what they're getting from their schools when they go to that school. I think that's a tremendous sign of progress in our efforts to address harassment in our educational systems. I have some specific recommendations for how I believe the department and OCR should provide leadership and guidance in this area going forward. And I make these remarks recognizing that we are in an important period in the history of civil rights educational law, as the department is currently reviewing all of its regulations as part of the administration's regulatory review and reform initiatives. And the department itself plans to issue in September a notice of proposed rulemaking regarding Title IX and sexual misconduct. I know and I fully expect that the debates over possible changes to OCR's regulations will be exceptionally heated and raucous, and deservedly so, given the stakes involved. I think that as we go forward, my first recommendation is that we should use the current and upcoming debate as an opportunity for the federal government and the entire education community, including students, parents, advocates, teachers, faculty members, administration officials, to address harassment issues in a reasonable, collaborative, and equitable way. As we move forward, and I do view us as moving forward, We need to recognize that regardless of what the policy and regulatory changes may be, the obligation and responsibility of schools at all levels to address harassment is not going away. Schools must continuously affirm that they will not tolerate harassment and take the necessary steps to address harassment effectively. Our discussions need to focus on how to get better from this fundamental principle forward. And one of the ways to get better is to heed the lessons learned. OCR, the Department of Education, and educational institutions across the country have learned a lot in the last 10 years, 20 years about how to develop and implement effective anti-harassment policies and procedures. We should also be looking to OCR's guidance, as OCR has been working through the facts of specific cases alleging harassment and becoming, in my view, more sophisticated and more nuanced in assessing the compliance issues related to harassment. I think this body of administrative case law, including past and current OCR cases, is very valuable and should be considered closely going forward. In the spirit of continuous improvement, I really do believe that we should use this public debate as an opportunity to heed the lessons learned by our educational institutions and by OCR so that we can all assess what has been working, what has not been working, and get even better at addressing these difficult rules. As part of this conversations, I think it's critical that OCR provide clear and reasonable rules. And in my experience at the department and at OCR, I always felt that we were our most effective as a federal civil rights agency when we were clear through our cases and through our guidance what compliance is, what compliance is not. I encourage the department to continue to provide clear, reasonable rules going forward. I also recommend that we take greater advantage of what I've referred to and what I view as kind of a treasure trove of guidance from OCR. OCR has been doing these cases for a long time. The racial harassment guidance came out in 1994, the sexual harassment guidance 2001. We're looking at decades of cases where OCR has looked at the specific facts of a case and said, yes, this is a violation, or no, this is not. I recommend that OCR consider publishing, with all appropriate redactions, all of its compliance determinations related to harassment. Right now, the website only includes resolution agreements and resolution letters, but does not include letters where the agency has said there was no violation. Again, if our common goal is to increase compliance with the civil rights laws that OCR enforces and reduce harassment of our students, greater understanding of the compliance requirements will, in my view, promote greater compliance. Another recommendation is that OCR provide more technical assistance. This to me seems almost like a no-brainer. Helping schools understand, helping communities understand what the federal laws require, I think has always been very effective, and that agencies should continue to provide technical assistance and provide more than it has been in the past year. Some specific suggestions were to update what was affectionately known as the NAG guide, a comprehensive multi-jurisdictional guide that was developed by OCR and the National Association of Attorneys Generals. Many schools found that to be very useful. Developing a model grievance policy. This has been a sort of pet project that's been in the works of the agency for many years, and I think that it would be very helpful to schools. And again, just providing more local assistance, working with local technical assistance, working directly with schools in the OCR region to help them come into compliance. And then finally, I believe that the department itself should take greater advantage of its own resources and data at the Institute of Educational Science and its National Center for Education Statistics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Osgood. Deja.
All right, thank you so much for inviting me today. And I appreciate everything that we've heard today about statistics, but I think, like Debbie, I'm coming from a place where I was actively investigating complaints of discrimination and harassment, actively investigating hate crimes and enforcing some of the laws. And currently I work with colleges and universities and educational institutions across the country to craft compliance programs. And I think what I'm seeing is that schools are really hungry for help and wanting to comply in this area and are looking for guidance, sort of the how to respond appropriately under the various civil rights laws. Some of the cases I've worked with have involved incidents like nooses being placed outside students' lockers or dorm rooms they've involved in sometimes really awful situations where LGBTQ students are harassed in schools and ultimately end up taking their own lives, and helping schools rebuild after something like that happens, and helping students within the schools understand how a behavior that maybe would be called a hate crime was just sort of one more building block that may or may not have contributed to pushing somebody towards a really, really fatal and difficult decision. So, that's sort of the context in which I'm working. And at OCR, we had a variety of civil rights laws, Title VI, Title IX, Section 504 of the Rehab Act that prohibited discrimination and harassment pretty broadly, and that required schools to respond promptly and appropriately when there were incidents at schools. One of the things that always struck me is that under Title VI, it was less clear in terms of a requirement for a grievance procedure. And so sometimes that raised reporting issues at schools. And, unfortunately, under Title VI, the discrimination prohibited is based on race, based on national origin, based on color. And these are some of the areas that we've heard people talk about throughout the day. And what we're seeing sometimes is that students and employees may not know what the process is for raising their hand and saying, this awful thing has happened to me on campus. And if the statute itself and the regulation doesn't require that schools have in place a grievance procedure that's published, just like these other laws. So, Debbie just talked about Title IX, where there are clearly requirements about what needs to be in place and what's expected to be in place. I think that there's less clarity around that under Title VI, which raises some issues, I think, for schools in responding to serious incidents like this. I think it would be really beneficial for schools to have more guidance documents about how to respond to incidents on campus where there are First Amendment implications. So sometimes schools are really aware that much student speech or employee speech may be protected, particularly in public institutions. And many private institutions have language in their policies and procedures that protect speech and expression in ways similar to the protections that public institutions are required to adhere to under the First Amendment. And I think what would be helpful for schools is if there could be some guidance that helped paint a little bit more of a picture of what to do when there are these incidents involving protected expression, where the conduct is tearing the community apart. So you may have students of color feeling targeted, feeling like they don't belong on a campus, feeling excluded, at the same time that the conduct at issue is protected under the First Amendment. And schools are having to navigate these issues as they happen, and I think are looking for help in doing this. So I think it would be helpful if it were possible for agencies like OCR, like the DOJ, to flesh out some of these issues, give examples. What do you do? How do we expect you to respond when an incident like this occurs? And then another piece is when there are incidents that don't quite rise to the level of a hate crime, but if you leave them and ignore them and let them fester, that's essentially where you'll be headed. And for some schools, there may, if you do a close analysis, it may not appear to trigger an obligation to respond under Title VI or Title IX, but the absence of a response could lead to a more serious incident that could constitute a hate crime. So I think also helping schools understand how to handle those types of incidents. So, do you conduct an investigation? If you do, what does that look like? How quickly are you doing it? Is the fact of your investigation chilling protected speech? Is there a way to structure that differently? And I think if there could be guidance around those types of areas, it would be incredibly beneficial to schools. And I see the clock ticking, so I'll just raise one more point that I think is really important. And I think in thinking about how schools and how agencies are interpreting what it means for conduct to be based on sex under Title IX, I think it would be helpful to be able to do that as broadly as possible. I think given some of the changes and the withdrawal of guidance that we've seen under Title IX, some schools may start to wonder the extent to which conduct involving LGBTQ students is protected. And I think if agencies, if OCR, if the DOJ can make clear that it's continuing to cover conduct aimed at students based on sex stereotyping and gender nonconformance and the types of issues that OCR historically has covered, even as far back as 2001 in that guidance, we're seeing language around sex stereotyping. And so I think if it can be made clear that those types of harassment and issues continue to be covered and continue to be a priority, it would be really helpful in preventing some of the climate issues that we see for LGBTQ students on campus, where we're seeing really high suicide rates and students feeling excluded on campus. And so those are the main points I wanted to raise, and I thank you for inviting me and for giving me a chance to hear the other panelists.
Thanks very much to all of our panelists. I'll open it up for my fellow commissioners' questions. I understand Commissioner Fladney, the question you are.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My questions actually revolve around most of what you've spoken about, and I think Mr. Austin's experience, and of course anybody else, please chime in. But you said that schools need some guidance, and of course First Amendment implications are very important. I believe one of our other witnesses on the panel before said something about speech that leads to worse conduct, and I think you just almost said the same thing. Are there any procedures or model programs or regulations that can be used to help schools in this regard? Because all we've heard about, to me, today is I've heard a lot about data, so I'm datted out. So
no disrespect.
I'm actually looking for a few solutions, because I know First Amendment is important to a lot of the commissioners here, and we've had cases. Thank you, Commissioner. We've had cases. We've seen cases lately where someone wears a T-shirt to school that's got inappropriate sayings on it, and then the parents take it to court, and you know, there's a whole thing. So can you give us any guidance, or do you know where we can look to find some of these types of regulations or approaches that are constitutional yet helpful?
I mean, I think in truth, this is what schools are asking for help with, because I think there isn't a lot of clear guidance and direction in this area. And it would be incredibly helpful if there were examples of what to do in the instance where a student wears a T-shirt that another student thinks is offensive, or a student feels microaggressed by. You know, how does a school handle that, and how do you balance you know, the needs and the rights of both students? And what schools are doing right now essentially is navigating really carefully through crucial conversations and putting on educational programming at the beginning of the school year and at various points during the school year to help students understand, yes, there is the First Amendment, but you know, we also really value certain students on campus. But you know, in terms of a particular program or a particular regulation, not that I have seen employed regularly.
And that's the problem, right?
In my mind, that's one of the issues. Yeah.
And in the cases that you've tried, how has speech interacted with conduct or hate crimes?
So respectfully, I don't see this as even close to an issue in the criminal conduct that I'm talking about. I don't think that the burning of a cross is a First Amendment issue. It's a crime. I don't think that the assault of a person based on their race, religion, national origin, sexual orientation is a speech issue. It's a crime.
Factual.
It's factual. Yeah. I mean, this isn't a close call for me over whether or not you, and I think it may be different in the civil context or in the school's context, but for the numbers that I'm talking about, and sorry that you're dated out, but that's kind of something that I feel very passionate about.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, no, but I'm just saying that it's not, this isn't an issue. It's already been determined, I think, by the Constitution, by the Supreme Court, that when you actually injure someone or do violence to someone, or you threaten someone based on their race, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, that it is in fact a crime.
Great, thank you very much. That's actually an answer I had to another question.
I'll turn to Commissioner Kirsten.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. I'm not dated out. In fact, I can use a lot more data. So the question I have to Ms. Langton is, in your PowerPoint, you have in there that approximately 50% in the National Crime Victimization Survey of crimes, hate crimes, are reported, compared to, I guess you've got a couple of different databases. How does that compare to overall crimes, the number of which are reported?
Commissioner Kirsten, do you mind just moving your microphone up?
Yeah, I think I broke it.
Oh, okay. Maybe you could switch with Commissioner Harris.
That's a great question, and it's actually pretty consistent with what we see for violent crime in general. The percentage that's reported gets higher when you talk about serious violent crime, which we define as rape, sexual assault, robbery, and aggravated assault. But that is fairly consistent with what we see overall for violent crime.
Okay, then the second question is, in employment discrimination jurisprudence, there's a concept known as mixed motive. That is, someone can make out a prima facie case that they were discriminated against or discharged on the basis of race. The employer says, no, he was discharged because he burned down the warehouse. In other words, there could be two reasons, but if the employer can establish that the person would have been discharged anyway, then that doesn't amount to racial discrimination, okay? In determining whether or not there's been a hate crime, you said there was corroborative evidence. Let's say somebody steals an iPhone in the midst of doing that, utters a racial epithet. How do you determine whether or not it's a hate crime or primarily motivated by economic crime?
So we're not making any determination. The NCVS classifies crimes based on their attributes. So if the victim says their phone was stolen, which it's stolen from them physically, which could be a robbery, and they believe that the offender was motivated by racial bias, and they say the evidence for that is that the offender used derogatory or hate language, we would classify that as a hate crime. So we're not making a judgment call. It's simply based on the attributes of the crime, based on the questions that we're asking. I mean, to your point, it is based on the victim's perception. So again, that may not rise to the level of evidence required for a law enforcement agency to record it as a hate crime. But I think that there's still intrinsic value in understanding that that victim perceived that crime to be motivated by bias.
Third, we've got victimization data. Do you have perpetrator or suspect data?
So that would be on the FBI side, where they would collect, especially through the NIBRS program, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, more detailed information about the offenders. But the National Crime Victimization Survey is really focused on the victims. We do ask the victims about their offenders and their perceptions of the offenders, but those can't be used to generate, say, rates of offending for particular groups.
And last, I pose this question to another panel. Are there any studies, data, evidence that show that designating something a hate crime deters, prevents, or reduces the incidence of that crime? And a subset to that is whether or not designating something as a federal hate crime reduces, deters, or prevents such crime.
So I don't have anything in my survey data that I could point to answer that question, and I'm not sure of particular data sources that would be used to address that question. Certainly the NCVS is a longitudinal survey, so we go back to victims or to respondents 7 times over the course of 3.5 years. So it would actually be an empirical question to see whether someone reports a hate crime in one wave of the survey and whether they experience a hate crime in later waves of the survey. I'm not sure you would be able to say that the actual reporting of that and their discussing that as a hate crime sort of would impact their behavior perhaps, or the preventative measures they would take personally. I'm not sure you could go that far with it, but that's about all you could say with the NCVS.
Is there any evidence that it assists in the apprehension of a suspect? designating something as a hate crime?
We don't have any evidence of that from the NCVS that we could speak to.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions.
So I also am not dated out. I saw that last month the BJS published a Federal Register notice of a request to OMB to revise the NCVS to raise the minimum age from 16 to 18, at which respondents will be administered questions about their sexual orientation and gender identity. And I wonder if you could explain to this commission what would be the value of knowing less about when youth are subject to crime based on sexual orientation or gender identity.
So just to be clear, we are not making any changes to the questions about hate crime and the questions about whether the crime was motivated by sexual orientation bias. Those questions will continue to be asked of all respondents age 12 or older. We have proposed raising the minimum wage, the minimum age, yes. Different conversation. The minimum age at which we're asking respondents about their sexual orientation. And that the comment period on that Federal Registry notice closes today, and we'll be reviewing the comments and assessing those and making a determination from there.
Thank you, but that was non-responsive. So my question is, what is the value of knowing less about the sexual orientation of victims of crimes or the gender identity?
Well, the concerns are more about the sensitivities of the data and the sensitivities of asking respondents that are minors and maybe in the presence of their parents those questions, less about the utility of the value of the data, trying to balance potential sensitivity issues with collecting those data.
And I think you were present during the earlier panel when the earlier panelists were talking about the civil rights data collection, which, as you may know, also collects that same data and manages the sensitivity while also getting the information. So it's, again, a surprise to me to see the suggestion to change it, which would diminish the value of the data that we've heard all day is substantially less valuable than it could be already.
We'll be reviewing the comments that are received and taking those into consideration, certainly.
I see that there are more questions, but I'm just going to take the microphone while I have it and ask my long list of questions, because I still can, and we have another half an hour. So to our former education folks, thank you for coming. In your time at the department, are you aware of any times when the department took particular steps focused on bias incidents in schools, maybe creating a task force or taking steps to try to address those incidents? And if so, could you describe what those steps were, whether they were effective, and what your views were about them?
I think there have been a number of steps. Obviously, the issuance of the policy guidance in racial harassment, sexual harassment, disability harassment, those have all been helpful. After 9/11, the department also issued a guidance or a letter reminding schools to take action not to discriminate against Arab American students. I think that was helpful. It was a very forceful leadership statement from the department, so I think that was helpful. I mentioned the NAG guide, which was a really remarkable accomplishment to get all of the national attorney generals and the OCR to publish this 600 and something page document, which provided some very specific guidance for schools about how to address this issue. We also work collaboratively with the Department of Justice, including one of the panelists here, on a number of harassment cases, including a case in Anoka, Hennepin, Minnesota, involving gender stereotyping, the University of Montana sex harassment and sexual violence cases. So there were those initiatives as well, which were part of the agency's enforcement package.
And am I to understand that those were particular targeted efforts, or were they just part of the regular enforcement package? And the distinction I'm trying to draw is whether you think that there's value in the agency affirmatively focusing on a particular area in its enforcement efforts.
I think that anytime the agency has focused on a particular area, we've seen progress. We've seen, I mentioned in the sexual violence area, we've seen better schools handling this issue better. So I would say, following that, my experience, yes, any type of increased attention generally leads to better compliance and better results.
Thank you.
I agree.
Succinct, thank you. Okay. In that same vein, Mr. Austin, I worked with you in our prior lives on some joint interagency task force work, in particular focused on AAPI harassment in this area. And I wonder if you could describe that work, the value that you saw in the work, if any, and whether you know of continuation of those efforts and whether you think they should continue now.
Yeah, and let me just start by, and I apologize for this, but I do want to address Mr. Kirstenau's questions and whether or not there's any deterrent effect or assist in the apprehension. I would say absolutely. First of all, in a country where we believe that greater sentences have a deterrent effect, the fact that there is usually a increased sentence, an enhancement based on the fact that something is a hate crime, certainly has a deterrent effect to the extent any of our laws provide a deterrent effect. Whether it assists in the apprehension, absolutely. I had a chance to work with Cynthia Deedle, Agent Deedle, on a number of investigations. And if I can bring the FBI in to investigate a hate crime, the likelihood of apprehending the individuals who were perpetrating that crime has increased dramatically. Not to mention just having the knowledge that a federal agency is going to be sitting on top of a local agency and demanding that that local agency actually do a proper investigation is going to increase the apprehension, the likelihood of apprehension of the subjects. And just, you can't understate the importance of public awareness over hate crimes, the condemnation, the shame that goes with that, and how that impacts whether or not someone is going to commit one in the future. So I just want to be clear that I think that without question, calling something a hate crime actually matters. And in my personal experience, it matters. And sorry, Chairwoman Lehman.
Totally fine, thank you.
But with respect to the work that we did in Anoka Hennepin, I mean, it was incredibly important because not only did we identify a problem, but there was actually work between the Department of Education and the Department of Justice on fixing that problem, on going into the school and working with the different communities that were impacted by it, on working with the teachers, the parents, everybody who was impacted by this, by making a statement to schools around the country over what was permissible and what was not permissible and what was be acceptable in this country and not acceptable in this country. I think the work that we did was incredibly important, was noted by communities around the country, and I haven't seen that work continuing today. It's really my answer.
Thank you. Separate and apart from the enforcement work that you just described, which I appreciate, I know you also led actual interagency task force focused on AAPI bullying and put out guidance and materials about it, but also that followed many, many listening sessions and interagency work together about understanding the scope of the problem and then trying to assess what appropriate next steps would be. In an earlier panel, we heard from Bob Musi about intra-DOJ work toward those same ends now, which sounded very impressive and laudable. He was not familiar with interagency work now continuing, and I wonder if you have a view about how valuable that work has been and whether it should continue.
And let me give credit to Jocelyn Samuels in large part because she was the head of a lot of the education work that was happening, and I had the opportunity to work very closely with her. You know, having a group of people from inside of a particular agency meet to discuss an important issue is a meeting. Okay, that's the meeting we could have any day at any time. It is so important to bring in, first of all, others who have a different expertise, a different experience, to bring in the community, to bring in the public to those meetings, because we don't know everything. If we're sitting in DOJ as important as we thought we were in DOJ, not working with the Department of Education, not working with the Department of Labor, not working with all these other departments, meant that we weren't getting all possible information, meant that we weren't doing the job that needed to be done. You must bring in other agencies and their expertise and their knowledge and their employees who are working so hard, or you're just not doing what needs to be done. And so having a meeting among DOJ people to congratulate DOJ people on the great job DOJ people are doing is not really a useful adventure.
Thank you. I'm going to hold my other questions for the moment because I understand that other commissioners have questions. Commissioner Narasaki.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So my first question is about data, and I get a little lost in all the acronyms and the different studies and who's doing them and what. But one of the issues that came up in an earlier panel is the fact that many immigrant communities may not be reporting on hate crimes because, particularly if they're undocumented or someone in their family or life is undocumented, they may fear the risk of that. My understanding is that potentially in at least one of the three databases, there's the NCBS, the UCR, and then NIBRS, or whatever that's called. They may actually have, because of the Patriot Act, the civil detainers, which is basically the list of people who should be deported if they're caught because they have violated the immigration laws. Is that a correct understanding? Does that exist in any of the databases, or is that just a rumor?
I can't speak to the NIBRS data, which is the National Incident-Based Reporting System. That's the FBI's, but not in the National Crime Victimization Survey, certainly not.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody know about the other ones?
I do not, but I would make one point, which is if someone who's undocumented goes to a non-governmental agency, so Catholic Charities or Bridge Refugee Services, and says, I was a victim of a hate crime, and that agency has a solid relationship with the FBI or Department of Justice, for example, and that's reported then to the FBI or DOJ, unless we initiate a case, that's not counted as a hate crime. So the FBI would never report that as one hate crime. We might agree that a crime was committed and write a report about that, but if that's not investigated or prosecuted by DOJ, that's not even one. That doesn't go anywhere.
No, but I'm saying that the concern is that immigrants may not be going to actually report to the police.
Right.
Because they're afraid that if they do, A, they'll be detained because the police will ask, or B, if it ends up in a database and it gets matched against a DHS list, they'll be deported. I'm just trying to understand the interaction between the various lists that exist in law enforcement land.
The only thing I can say is that if that scenario happened when I was still with the FBI, there was no cross-pollination with Homeland Security. So if an undocumented immigrant came to the FBI and said, I've been a victim of a hate crime, and that went into our database, that information was not submitted or had access to Homeland Security that then would act on the undocumented status of the victim.
Great, that's helpful to know. Then the second thing is, so several people have remarked upon the fact that the federal government itself is not reporting data on hate crimes, but asking the states to. And you were candid enough to note, Mr. Austin, that even in your administration that didn't happen. So why is it not happening? Are there barriers? What needs to happen to try to make that happen?
There's not a barrier that I'm aware of. I actually used to get monthly reports of the hate crime investigations that were being conducted by the FBI and the prosecutions that were being done by the Civil Rights Division. Those reports, I would assume, are still being done. Someone decided not to make those things public, but people will come and testify on the Hill before a commission such as this, and they will say what the numbers are. But we go all the way back, I want to say like 15, 20 years of having these numbers across every piece of work that's done by the Civil Rights Division. I know that the FBI also has similar numbers, but they are never released publicly.
So if our staff went and asked for the data, we wouldn't be told that there's some sort of privilege over it that would keep us from getting it?
I am unaware of any privilege that would prevent you from getting it, but I don't know what they might say.
Great. Thank you. Oh, I just have one more question about the interagency, sorry.
Go ahead.
So one of the things that struck me about the interagency task force that has existed in the past on hate crimes, and particularly, I believe it also was part of the effort to address bullying against Asian American and Pacific Islander students, is the involvement of HHS, and particularly their mental health agencies. And I was intrigued by that, and I would like to understand why that's an important component of that kind of task force.
The DOJ knows how to prosecute people. Okay? HHS is much more in the world of mental health. You want those experts in there. You want that expertise in there. Just like, again, DOJ is in the business of prosecuting people, and you want Department of Education to say, well, what makes a good educational environment? This is why we have what's called crisis intervention training for law enforcement. The idea that law enforcement officers shouldn't be the ones necessarily always dealing with people who are in some kind of mental health crisis. You actually want a social worker, you want someone who knows it to save lives. So you want people's expertise, and that expertise does not sit in any one agency. It doesn't sit in any one body.
And is there, I mean, we heard also from a couple of witnesses, particularly some of our witnesses who were personally victims or connected to victims, about the intersection of mental health issues, both in terms of being a victim, but also being a perpetrator. How much work is being done in the federal government to understand that and to look at how can you address where the mental health issues are in terms of trying to help those who, so you can avoid an action coming in the form of a hate crime because you have failed to address the mental health issues?
I would actually pass to my education panelists.
Yes, no, I was asking everyone. It's
Yeah,
not just,
okay, sorry.
I'm not just picking on you.
Sorry. No, I just think that that's where so much of this work can be done, not from a law enforcement officer, but by an educator.
And I agree. I think that's one of the critical pieces that's missing is focusing on mental health issues among students. And as you know, many schools struggle to provide effective mental health services to students. Many are under-resourced. That's a topic that comes up often. And part from what I saw at OCR and even now, part of an effective institutional response to hate crimes on campus or bullying or harassment on campus is making sure that students have resources. So students on both sides of the issue, the person who's the target of the harassment or discrimination, and then also the person who's perpetrating. And schools, for example, this is one way that Title IX, I think, gets it right, is that schools are actively offering to students, as soon as they come in the door, or to employees, connections to on-campus and off-campus resources to address mental health issues and to target that. And I think that happens to a lesser degree under other statutes. So when there are issues of racial or disability harassment coming up, we're seeing less of that. But I don't think there is the type of targeted and thoughtful response that you're talking about where educators and various groups at the government or at schools are getting together to think through how to address this systematically. I don't think that's happening, but it's hugely needed.
I would say I agree, but also add that there had been talk for a number of years of the department providing some guidance, perhaps with DOJ, on direct threat, students that pose a risk to themselves or others, and how should schools handle it, what type of accommodations, what type of leave policy should be in place, and that it never really came to any formal fruition. And so I would add that to the list of items that BC mentioned in terms of where greater clarity would be helpful.
Okay. Thank you so much.
So for example, if that guidance were written, it would be good if it were released.
Yes.
Commissioner Degoy?
Dr. Langton, I have a question for you, understanding that you don't have this absolute power. But first, I want to ask, what is your view about the quality of the data? Your former colleague had a view about the data not being of the highest quality. I'm just wondering, you as a statistician, what is your view of the quality of the data that you have to analyze?
So are you asking me about the quality of the FBI data or the quality of the National Crime Victimization Survey data?
Well, both.
So I'll speak to the quality of the National Crime Victimization Survey. And, I think it's considered the gold standard in victimization surveys and plays a really important role. And the Census Bureau is our data collection agent, and we, BJS and the Census Bureau, have policies and procedures in place at every stage to try to ensure that we're collecting data that are accurate and reliable. So starting from even the development of the questions and the process that we go through, working with folks with expertise to make sure that we're developing questions that are understood and are capturing the concepts that we're trying to measure. The testing process that we go through with those questions to then administer them to potential respondents and ensure that respondents can answer the questions in the way that we think they're going to answer them and that they're comprehending the question the way that we're intending. And then We have extensive testing that we do with our interviewers to ensure that they're administering the survey in a manner that's consistent for all respondents. We have all sorts of data quality procedures and cleaning procedures that are put into place to ensure that the final data are high quality and accurate and reliable. And obviously the National Crime Victimization Survey captures much higher counts of hate crime victimization than what you see in the UCR data. And there are a number of reasons for that. And that's part of the reason that we have the National Crime Victimization Survey, to serve as that sort of complementary measure and to get at both the dark figure, the hidden figure of crime, and also to collect data that is not filtered through any sort of lenses. Police data are filtered, whether it's filtered at the law enforcement level or it's filtered in what law enforcement agencies report to the UCR. There's some potential there for that filter, and we're collecting information directly from residents.
Do you think there's underreporting in that data nevertheless?
Absolutely. There's error in every data source, and there's absolutely going to be some underreporting in the National Crime Victimization Survey. You're asking people about very sensitive topics, and so that's absolutely a problem. You know, we try to put measures in place to ensure confidentiality, privacy of interviews, putting all these procedures in place to encourage respondents to report on what happened, but that's always a possibility.
Thank you. Mr. Austin, you suggested that perhaps one way to improve the FBI data, I take it, was to have mandatory reporting. Is that right?
That is correct.
Now, would that stand in contrast to general crime reports that the FBI gets? Meaning, aren't all of the crime reports voluntary?
They are.
So what would be the policy? How would we think about this as a policy justification to say that hate crimes are so important that they should be mandatory and other crimes should be voluntary?
So I actually wouldn't make that distinction. And so my feelings are actually across all of our crime data. I think most of our crime data is really bad. And we should be doing better. And for a country that values public safety as much as we do, it is actually embarrassing how bad our crime numbers are across the board. And I think it's just as easy to collect your hate crimes data at the same time. And I think that's what NCVS does, is collects their hate crimes data along with their regular crime data. That's the census does it. The same thing should be done with law enforcement agencies when you're seeking UCR data.
So are you making a larger point then that perhaps the extent to which our crime data overall suffers the deficiency of being based on voluntary reporting, our criminal justice policies and investments may not be well put because they're based on garbage in, garbage out data?
Absolutely, but I would say the hate crimes data is particularly laughable when you have, states where you know more than 7 hate crimes have occurred, reporting 7 hate crimes, and using that to make any decision, I think is a real problem.
Thank you. Ms. Osgood and Ms. Okubadejo. I definitely need to pronounce that name correctly with a name like Adegbile. So my sister here. So my questions to you go to the impact in the higher ed space in particular of having guidance and certain policy pronouncements put in place and then taken away as they're starting to take root. Obviously, administrations have the opportunity to have their own view about their policy pronouncements, but particularly in some areas where the law is starting to become established or to bring greater protections to communities that have been found to be particularly susceptible to certain dangers in our schools. I'm just wondering what the policy, or forget the policy, what are the real world implications of that whipsaw effect for our kids?
So I do a lot of presentations where I talk about the protections for transgender students and the changes in federal policy, changes in federal law. I always remind schools that they can do more than is actually required by the laws, that they can protect even if it's not specifically with protected under OCR guidance or the like. I think you're suggesting that there's kind of almost a whipsaw effect of once a policy is issued, it's starting to sort of blossom and we're seeing some progress and then it's withdrawn. I think that's a fair observation. I do think even with the withdrawal of the transgender guidance and the issuance of the interim guidance for sexual violence, we have made progress. I think students are better protected than they were. And now, in my view, we're in this kind of period of recalibration where there's an agreement as to principle maybe, but how we get there, we're going to have pretty robust debates about.
I mean, I think it really depends on the context. And for some students, I would say with withdrawal of the, and employees also, withdrawal of the transgender guidance in particular was devastating for some and in some cases dangerous, because I think the message that some heard was that it is now okay again to discriminate and to treat people differently and to, you know, impose discipline if somebody uses quote unquote the wrong restroom. And so I think those types of changes can be really difficult. Luckily though, I think what Debbie is saying is true, that schools for the most part, and none of the schools with which I work made any kinds of changes to their internal policies or procedures when that guidance was withdrawn, because I think they were recognizing that all students are important members of their communities and all students will be protected and the rights of all students will be respected. And so, you know, I didn't see immediate changes, but, you know, I can imagine circumstances and, you know, cases where maybe I wasn't involved in a rural school district where a school district made maybe a different decision than they would have made pre-withdrawal of guidance. So I think that can be challenging and can be confusing to schools sometimes if there's a lot of back and forth.
Thank you.
Thank you for that also.
One last question to Agent Deedle or former Agent Deedle. I want your view of the relationship between the federal government and local law enforcement. You're somebody who had a long career enforcing some of these laws, investigating these laws, shall I say, in the context of the federal power and the federal law. And obviously there are many state laws, as we all know, and as a general matter, very often the states go first, but sometimes there is a helpful, as we've heard from Mr. Austin, collaboration and a federal presence. So I'm wondering, for example, had you been at the FBI at the time of Charlottesville, how would you have understood the relationship between the federal government and the local officials that were responding to the events that we all witnessed and some of our earlier witnesses in very tragic ways?
Thank you for your question. The FBI would not be able to do its job without information and intelligence. We would also fail miserably without having relationships in place, not just with local law enforcement, but with so many people in the community, with community leaders, with education leaders. We would fail miserably. I think one of the things the FBI does well in all of our field offices is to establish and strengthen the relationships with local law enforcement. So every special agent in charge has a very solid, healthy, strong relationship with all of the police chiefs and sheriffs, the state police officers, school resource officers oftentimes too, to make sure that when there is something like Charlottesville or another tragedy, there's already those relationships in place to be able to have a very quick conversation, to have a dialogue very quickly about, Mr. Police Chief, Miss Police Chief, what do you need? This is what we can do to help you. Do you want us to hang back for a little while? Just tell us what you need, because this is what we can help you with. If those relationships are if they're not already established, it makes it really difficult to respond effectively to whether it's a hate crime tragedy or a police misconduct situation. It's very difficult to respond with trust and transparency if those relationships are not already solid. So I think the FBI does a really good job with partnering with local law enforcement and establishing those relationships before there's a problem. I think what we can always offer is we're here. I think that Roy talked about that too. We're here, we can help. We have a lot of tools, we have a lot of resources, we have a lot of money, and a lot of very committed and passionate people that are here to help in a variety of ways. But we like it to be collaborative. We don't want to impose the will of the FBI on a local law enforcement agency without it being a collaborative partnership that just works more effectively. So I do think we do a good job with that. And especially if those relationships are already set, I think we respond more effectively.
Are there ever circumstances where the feds go first?
There are. So I've had a number of cases when I was an agent and a supervisor and unit chief that for a particular hate crime situation, it was the decision not just of the FBI, but also the Department of Justice, that the interest of justice were to be served if the FBI and DOJ went first. Those are very rare circumstances. And I think Roy and I have had numerous conversations about this. I think the power of the federal government in this area is most effective if we serve as that backstop. So we are here if you need resources, if we are here if maybe we need to go first. But we like all those decisions and discussions to be, again, collaborative. We certainly don't want to make a decision with DOJ to go first in a hate crime situation without the agreement and participation of that local law enforcement agency and the victim too. We want to be a very transparent decision-making process with the victim and the community as well. So we do go first, but that's a very rare circumstance. Sure, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Yaki?
Thank you very much. Thank you all, for the panel, for your discussion today. To me, there seems to be two sort of underreporting issues that we're talking about today. One is on the victim side. And as much as we're almost out of time, I'm not going to go into that other than to say that part of me believes that when you have rhetoric from policy leaders that diminishes the worth of those groups who would want, or individuals who would want to report because they are Mexican American, because they are an immigrant, because they see that the consent decree for the police department is no longer in place, diminishes the confidence of people to do that. But I'm not going to talk about that. What I want to talk about, because we have very little time, is that there is one of the persons this morning said, I want to direct this at Ms. Ross and Ms. Langton. When I asked the question about how do you get at the issue of underreporting by state agencies, which is a different issue than the underreporting by victims, which can be impacted by outside factors. The answer this person gave was resources, that they have antiquated, for lack of a better word, it sounded like antiquated computers that couldn't process data and get the data to DOJ in the appropriate form or whatever. I want to know whether or not, A, you believe that's how believable that is. I'm not saying it isn't believable, but in terms of importance, is it lack of will? Is it lack of interest? Is it lack of capital infrastructure?
I'm just going to make one quick point to answer your question. I've had those conversations with police chiefs and sheriffs in my career, the ones that do not report. And I've asked them, why don't you report? And I get every answer that you just gave just now. I get answers of, I don't have time for that. I don't have an intern that can do that. My computer broke. Why do I have to do that? My state agency doesn't mandate that I do that. I've gotten every response you possibly can think of.
My K-9 unit ate the paperwork or something like that.
I don't have paperwork that can, I've heard many. And I think I gave you this answer right before the hearing started, but I think one way to address that, the answer of, I just can't get that done, is to continue to put the onus back on the FBI to say, look, FBI, you collect all the data. This is your data. You put out the data, you analyze the data, you collect the data. The FBI has to do a much better job getting the data and convincing sheriffs and police chiefs to put their information into a system that then the FBI and that Lynn can access. But in response to the questions of, I just can't get that done, there's always an answer. And the answer could be, what do you need? Do you need an intern? Well, let's look at the local community college and get a criminal justice intern to help you, Mr. Police Chief, and she can take that data down and enter it into your system. Do you not have the money to upgrade your computer system? We're going to go back to DOJ and we're going to get you a grant that's going to fund your system and make it better. Do you not see value in reporting? Well, let's talk about that too. There was always an answer, but the issue is you had to have that conversation. So the special agent in charge, not that I ever was one, but the FBI had to have that conversation with local law enforcement to find out, why are you not reporting? Help us. We want the data. We want the information. If you're having a problem, we're going to help you fix it.
And just really quickly, first of all, I need to correct Cynthia. She kept speaking of the FBI and DOJ because she's an FBI agent. DOJ is actually over the FBI, but sometimes they forget that. The only other thing I would point out is just the fact that it really, there's not a law enforcement agency in this country that is worth its salt that does not collect data on the crimes that are happening. For them to say they can't release it is actually usually pretty silly. Okay, they have it. They know their homicide numbers. They know the vandalism numbers. They know the shoplifting numbers. They have those numbers. It is really, in most cases, a lack of will in a decision not to have their agents, their officers, their deputies ask the question, you know, why do you think this happened to you? Well, I think it happened to me because of the color of my skin. I think it happened to me because of my sexual orientation. And then checking a box to say that is the reason, and then putting that information into whatever system they currently use. There certainly isn't a major law enforcement agency in this country that doesn't collect data across the crimes and then sit down and tell everybody what that is. Because if they didn't, the sheriffs wouldn't be elected or the police chiefs wouldn't be appointed.
And just to take this in a slightly different direction, moving away from the infrastructure issues, I think, you know, the big improvement that we're making to the National Crime Victimization Survey right now, which is a major undertaking beginning in 2016, is to change our sample design so that we can collect state level or produce state level estimates of victimization, including hate crime, for the 22 most populous states, as I mentioned earlier. And that gives the ability to at least then triangulate at the state level between the FBI data and the NCVS and potentially even local law enforcement data too, to be able to piece together this picture of where there are these discrepancies in terms of, we have 110,000 victims saying that they're reporting to police that they experienced a hate crime. When we drill down then at the state level, what does that mean in terms of how many victimizations are getting recorded and reported by law enforcement?
Okay, so we are past time, but the Vice Chair is going to take us home with the last question of the day.
All right, then. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I thank our panelists for being with us today. It's been absolutely wonderful. Through the materials that I read in preparation for this hearing and from the testimony that I've received, at this point, I've been convinced that the collection of good data is absolutely imperative to combating hate crimes. And yet we've heard repeatedly today information that causes us to question the validity and the value of the data. Through other panelists and through you, Mr. Austin, we've heard ways to improve the system of collecting data. One of our earlier panelists said that one of the ways that we can improve the data collection is for us to have our communities require that our law enforcement agencies or their local law enforcement agencies are accountable. So hold them accountable. You send up information saying there wasn't a single hate crime committed in your jurisdiction. Folks in the community ought to be up in arms saying, huh? How in the world could you possibly come up with that? I'd like to get your thoughts, or anyone that wants to offer on whether that is in fact a valid a way to approach this, and if there are any other ways that we can bring our communities into this so as to improve our data collection.
So I very much appreciate your question, and that was part of the reason why I read the lengthy list of large communities that do not report, because the millions of people who watch C-SPAN, hopefully at least one of them is in one of those communities and heard that and will say, I need to make a move on this. Look, I think communities drive most of our change, and communities are the ones who can decide who's going to be the next mayor, the next police chief, the next sheriff, and what's not. The problem is that, you know, some things the federal government is just better at, and it needs to take ownership of this problem and do something about it. And our Congress needs to take ownership of this problem and do something about it. Yes, I would love if our communities stepped up and forced their jurisdictions to do so, but our communities are worried about getting their kids to school and their health care and their the food on the table and just, you know, making sure that their kids are all right. Data about hate crimes is not necessarily in their top 10 list. And I think it is something which a federal government needs to step forward and take ownership of.
I always hate when I agree with you. I would just, where I thought you were going with that was where you went. So I hate to put that responsibility on a community. I hate to make people have to think about, is my kid safe in school? Do we have health care? And then also, I think the hate crime stats are inadequate. I hate to put that on them, but I would love someone to take up that cause in every community and make Honolulu, who doesn't report anything, I would love to make the community in Honolulu report their data or force their law enforcement agency to report. But I do think that at the end of the day, it is the responsibility of the FBI. They collect it. I think they have to do a much better job to go out and get it. And I hope that that's something that changes in due time.
Thank you very much to this panel for the day. This is amazing testimony. We really appreciate it. We are going to break and reconvene at 5 p.m. for the open public comment period. All participants in the open public comment period should report back at 4:45 p.m. As a brief reminder that registration for that open public comment period is still open. So we'll recess now until 5. Thank you very much.